Let's start by understanding what actually makes dark psychology different from normal psychology. In traditional psychology, we explain human behavior through emotion, mental processes, or psychological disorders. We focus on how people cope, what they feel, or what might be going wrong internally. But in dark psychology, we go beyond explaining. We look at how it can be used to influence, manipulate, and control a person's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. In this guide, we'll be exploring dark psychology in depth. We'll begin by looking at the core traits often found in dark personalities: narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and sadism. Each one explains not just how someone thinks, but how they treat people. Then we'll look at manipulation in action. From common tactics like gaslighting and guilt-tripping to more subtle forms of influence, like silence, mirroring, or emotional leverage. These aren't always aggressive. In fact, they often come disguised as care, humor, or logic. We'll examine how these techniques show up in relationships, friendships, and even in the workplace, not just in extreme situations, but in everyday life, where they gradually reshape how someone sees themselves. And just as importantly, we'll look at how to recognize these patterns before they take root. What kind of people are most vulnerable to manipulation? What red flags appear early? And how you can build protection without losing trust in everyone around you. Dark psychology isn't about paranoia, it's about clarity. This guide will help you name it, see it, and understand it. Narcissism. Narcissism is one of 4 traits that make up what psychologists call the dark tetrad, a group of personality patterns linked to manipulation, control, and emotional coldness. At its core, narcissism is built on an inflated sense of self-importance. People with narcissistic tendencies often believe they deserve special treatment, admiration, and attention, regardless of what they've done to earn it. They may talk about their achievements constantly, dismiss others' opinions, or dominate conversations with stories that revolve around themselves. But narcissism isn't just about arrogance. It often hides deeper insecurity. Many narcissists depend on external validation to maintain their self-image. When they feel ignored, criticized, or challenged, they may respond with defensiveness, blame-shifting, or even emotional aggression. The goal is to protect their sense of superiority at any cost. A common sign of narcissism is a lack of empathy. Narcissists may show concern when it benefits them, but they struggle to genuinely connect with others' feelings. This detachment allows them to overlook boundaries, dismiss feedback, and exploit relationships without guilt. In relationships, narcissism can show up as control. They might decide where you go, what you wear, or who you spend time with, not through direct orders, but through subtle disapproval, backhanded compliments, or emotional withdrawal. They often use praise and affection strategically, offering it when they feel admired and withholding it when they don't. Another common behavior is the need to be seen as the victim or hero in every scenario. If something goes wrong, it's never their fault. If someone else gets credit, they may downplay it or find a way to redirect the spotlight. This tendency to rewrite reality isn't always malicious. It's a defense mechanism. But over time, it can erode trust and communication. Not everyone who acts selfishly is a narcissist. The key difference lies in the pattern. True narcissistic behavior is persistent, strategic, and deeply rooted in how the person views themselves and others. It's not just a moment of self-focus, it's a worldview centered on entitlement. Understanding narcissism isn't about diagnosing people. It's about recognizing behavior that consistently prioritizes control and admiration over honesty and connection. When you can identify that pattern, it becomes easier to set limits, protect your perspective, and avoid being drawn into a one-sided dynamic. Machiavellians. Machiavellianism centers around calculated manipulation. It's not impulsive or emotional, it's deliberate. People high in this trait view relationships through the lens of advantage. Trust isn't a connection, it's a weakness to be studied and used. This mindset is rooted in long-term strategy. Machiavellian individuals are often observant and analytical. They don't just react, they plan. They may present themselves as agreeable, supportive, or harmless, all while gathering information to serve their own interests. What sets them apart is their emotional detachment. They can lie convincingly without guilt, flatter without sincerity, and create alliances purely for control. While others are concerned with fairness or connection, Machiavellians focus on outcomes. In conversation, they may agree outwardly, but steer things behind the scenes. They might praise you one moment, then quietly reposition things in their favor. Their tactics aren't loud, they're methodical. The goal isn't to destroy trust outright. It's to bend it just enough to keep others predictable and manageable. This kind of manipulation often goes unnoticed at first because it doesn't rely on confrontation. It works in layers, slowly influencing decisions, shaping perceptions, and eroding boundaries while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. Not all strategic people are Machiavellian. The key difference lies in intent. While a strategist might seek mutual benefit, a Machiavellian operates with a mindset of control. Relationships become tools, and empathy becomes optional. Understanding this trait isn't about labeling someone as scheming. It's about recognizing when charm is being used as a mask, when trust is being mined rather than earned, and when influence is being exercised without transparency. Psychopathy. Psychopathy is often misunderstood as extreme violence or criminal behavior. In reality, it's more about emotional detachment and a lack of empathy. People with strong psychopathic traits tend to act without concern for how their actions affect others. They're often calm under pressure, not because they're grounded, but because they don't feel the same emotional depth most people do. A defining feature of psychopathy is the inability to connect with other people's emotions. They may understand what someone is feeling on a surface level, but that understanding doesn't lead to concern, guilt, or hesitation. This makes it easier for them to lie, manipulate, or hurt others without remorse. Psychopaths often appear charming and confident. They may speak smoothly, tell convincing stories, and know how to read social situations. But their charm is usually calculated. It's used to gain trust, control situations, or disarm suspicion. Impulsivity is another key trait. Many psychopaths act quickly and recklessly, focused only on short-term rewards. They might take major risks without thinking about consequences, whether in relationships, business, or daily life. This combination of low empathy and high impulsiveness can make their behavior unpredictable and dangerous. However, not all psychopaths are openly aggressive or violent. Some hold steady jobs, maintain relationships, and operate in everyday environments. What sets them apart is how they treat people behind closed doors. They may play with emotions, break promises without hesitation, or shift blame whenever something goes wrong. In manipulative situations, psychopathy gives a person the ability to cause harm without flinching. They don't need to justify their actions emotionally because they don't feel responsible in the same way. This detachment makes them especially difficult to confront. Emotional appeals don't work, and guilt doesn't slow them down. It's important to remember that psychopathy exists on a spectrum. Not everyone with a few of these traits is a psychopath. The concern begins when the behavior is consistent, strategic, and emotionally cold. When someone repeatedly uses charm, lies, or aggression to control others without empathy, they are operating from a mindset that sees people as tools rather than individuals. Understanding psychopathy helps make sense of certain patterns that don't respond to emotional reasoning. It explains why some people seem unaffected by guilt, untouched by consequences, and unmoved by the harm they cause. Their emotional system functions differently, and that difference often reveals itself through behavior, not confession. Sadism. Sadism, in the context of dark psychology, is the tendency to gain satisfaction from the pain, discomfort, or humiliation of others. It's not always physical. In many cases, it's psychological, emotional, or social. What defines sadism isn't just the act itself, it's the motive behind it. The goal isn't to fix a problem, win an argument, or defend a belief. It's to cause harm and to feel good doing it. Unlike psychopathy, which involves emotional numbness, sadism involves emotional engagement, just in a disturbing way. A sadist isn't detached. They're often fully present. They may smile when someone else fails, laugh when others are in distress, or feel powerful when they make someone cry. It's the enjoyment of control through cruelty. Sadistic behavior can take many forms, and not all of them are easy to spot. In some cases, it's obvious, like bullying, harassment, or deliberate humiliation, but it can also be subtle. A coworker who always finds a way to mock others during meetings. A partner who enjoys bringing up your insecurities at the worst possible moment. A friend who sets people up to embarrass themselves just to watch it happen. These actions often come with a layer of denial or fake innocence, but the pattern is clear. They feel better when others feel worse. One of the more dangerous aspects of sadism is its potential to escalate. When someone gets emotional satisfaction from harming others, they may seek out more opportunities to do it. They may push boundaries, gradually testing how far they can go. This is especially true when the environment rewards cruelty through power, attention, or a lack of consequences. Sadism isn't limited to extreme personalities or criminal behavior. In fact, many people with sadistic tendencies live ordinary lives. They hold jobs, maintain relationships, and often appear polite or even friendly. But when they sense weakness, stress, or emotional vulnerability in others, they shift. They poke, prod, and provoke, not by mistake, but with intent. In some cases, sadistic people frame their behavior as a joke or pretend they're just being honest or blunt. But the goal isn't clarity, it's control. They often target people who are empathetic, insecure, or unwilling to fight back. That imbalance is part of what gives them satisfaction. There's also a social element to sadism. Some individuals enjoy harming others more when there's an audience. Public humiliation, social media takedowns, and group bullying can all feed the sadistic mindset. It's not just about causing pain. It's about being seen doing it. Understanding sadism means recognizing that cruelty isn't always random or reactive. For some people, it's intentional and rewarding. And while most people avoid harming others, sadists actively seek it out, not in moments of weakness, but in moments of choice. Gaslighting. Gaslighting is one of the most effective techniques in dark psychology used to manipulate perception and gain control. Unlike overt aggression, this method works by gradually distorting a person's sense of reality. At its core, gaslighting is about denying what's real. It can be as simple as, "I never said that," or "you're imagining things." But when repeated over time, These moments chip away at a person's confidence in their memory, judgment, and instincts. What makes gaslighting especially harmful is how slowly it takes hold. It doesn't usually start with bold lies. It begins with little corrections or challenges, often wrapped in concern or calm disagreement. The manipulator may appear composed, while the other person begins to feel irrational or unstable for questioning them. This technique often creates emotional confusion. The target starts wondering whether they're too sensitive, too reactive, or not remembering things clearly. They begin to rely more and more on the manipulator's version of events, not because they trust them, but because they've lost trust in themselves. Over time, gaslighting can isolate someone emotionally. They might stop talking to others about what's happening, fearing they'll be seen as dramatic or confused. They may withdraw from support systems, believing they're the problem, not the situation. This isolation only deepens the manipulator's control. Gaslighting can happen in romantic relationships, workplaces, families, and friendships. It doesn't rely on yelling or threats. In fact, it often thrives on calm delivery. That contrast between the manipulator's composure and the target's rising anxiety makes the manipulation even more disorienting. Eventually, the person on the receiving end may stop defending their perspective altogether. They begin to second-guess their feelings, reinterpret their experiences, and apologize for things they didn't do. That's when gaslighting has done its job. It's made someone question themselves more than they question the manipulator. Recognizing gaslighting isn't always easy in the moment. It's built to be invisible. But the pattern leaves clues, a growing sense of self-doubt, a shift in how someone talks about their own memory, or a fear of speaking up altogether. When that pattern repeats, it's not overthinking. It's being undermined. Projection. Projection is when someone shifts their own thoughts, feelings, or behaviors onto someone else to avoid dealing with them. It's a defense mechanism, often unconscious, used to protect the ego. But in the context of dark psychology, projection becomes a manipulation tool. It allows someone to dodge accountability, shift blame, and confuse the people around them. The basic idea is simple. A person accuses someone else of what they themselves are doing. Someone who is lying might accuse you of being dishonest. Someone who's emotionally unavailable might call you cold. Instead of facing their own flaws, they place them onto others, making it harder to call them out without looking defensive. This tactic often works because it creates confusion. You know the accusation isn't accurate, but it still puts you on the spot. You end up justifying your behavior, explaining yourself, or second-guessing your own intentions. Meanwhile, the person projecting avoids any real conversation about their actions. Projection shows up in all kinds of relationships. In a romantic context, a partner who's being unfaithful might suddenly become overly jealous or accuse the other of cheating. Their guilt creates anxiety, and instead of processing it, they push it outward. This keeps the focus off them and puts the other person on the defensive. In workplaces, a manager who's disorganized might accuse an employee of being unreliable. The accusation has less to do with the employee's performance and more to do with the manager's own internal chaos. It becomes a way to maintain control, shift responsibility, and avoid self-reflection. Projection can also be subtle. A person who's angry might say, "Why are you so upset?" Or someone who's feeling insecure might accuse others of being overly competitive or judgmental. These statements aren't just misunderstandings. They redirect uncomfortable feelings outward, so the person doesn't have to face them internally. In darker forms of manipulation, projection becomes a repeated pattern. It's not just about occasional defensiveness. It's about actively shaping someone else's reality. The manipulator makes the target feel like the problem, even when they're reacting to clear mistreatment. This dynamic erodes self-confidence over time and makes it difficult to recognize who's responsible for what. What makes projection effective is that it can sound plausible, especially if emotions are already high. If someone accuses you of being selfish or disloyal, it can trigger doubt, even if their behavior is the issue. That's the trap. Projection turns confrontation into confusion, making it harder to hold someone accountable. Understanding projection means noticing when blame doesn't match behavior. It's recognizing when criticism feels more like a mirror than a message. In everyday life, it's often brushed off as denial or exaggeration. But when used repeatedly, projection becomes a tactic of control. It protects the manipulator's self-image by placing their emotional baggage on someone else. And over time, that weight can shape how the other person sees themselves, if they're not careful. Isolation. Isolation, in the context of dark psychology, isn't just about being alone. It's about being cut off, slowly and strategically, from support, perspective, and confidence. Manipulators use isolation to gain control over another person's thoughts and decisions. The goal is simple. Remove outside influences, so the target becomes more dependent, more doubtful, and easier to manage. Unlike physical isolation, which might involve locking someone in a room, psychological isolation happens through small, believable actions, until the person no longer knows who to trust or where to turn. It usually starts with subtle pressure. A manipulator might suggest that certain friends are a bad influence, or they may claim that family members don't really care. They're just jealous. They never liked you. They don't understand us. These comments don't sound hostile. They're framed as concern, but they carry a clear message. Distance yourself from others. Over time, the social circle gets smaller. Invitations get turned down. Messages go unanswered. Conflict is stirred up behind the scenes to make others feel uncomfortable or unwelcome. The person being targeted may not even notice how much they've pulled back until they feel completely alone. In romantic relationships, isolation can look like a partner who wants to spend all their time together. At first, it seems romantic, but soon there's pushback whenever outside plans are made. Friends are criticized. Hobbies are mocked. Even work commitments are questioned. The aim is to create a bubble where the manipulator has full emotional access and minimal interference. In family dynamics, it might show up as a parent who insists they're the only one who truly understands you. They discourage friendships, challenge therapists, or dismiss the value of outside help. The person being isolated feels loyal, but also more anxious, more dependent, and more unsure of their own judgment. Isolation also shows up in group settings. In workplaces or social circles, a manipulative leader may pit people against each other, creating subtle divisions. One person is left out of meetings. Another is told confidential information meant to stir doubt. It creates a fractured environment where people feel unsure of who to trust, and more likely to rely on the manipulator for clarity and validation. What makes isolation so powerful is that it removes perspective. Without outside voices, it becomes harder to recognize red flags, question harmful behavior, or feel supported when something feels wrong. The isolated person may start to blame themselves, believing they're the problem, not the victim. Manipulators rely on that silence. When someone has no one else to talk to, they're easier to influence. They can be told what's true, what's right, and what matters, without anyone to challenge it. Understanding how isolation works is key to recognizing its early signs. It's not about a lack of people. It's about the quiet removal of voices that offer support, balance, and reality. And once those voices are gone, manipulation becomes much easier to maintain. Positive reinforcement. At its core, positive reinforcement means rewarding a behavior to encourage it to happen again. When someone receives something they value, attention, praise, affection, or approval, right after they do something specific, they're more likely to repeat that action. It's how habits are formed, how patterns are shaped, and how relationships can be influenced without force or threat. In everyday life, this happens all the time. A child gets a treat for finishing their homework. An employee receives recognition for staying late. A friend gets extra affection after doing a favor. These moments teach people what earns approval and what gets attention. Over time, the reward becomes linked to the behavior, even if the connection is never directly stated. In healthy settings, positive reinforcement helps build consistency, motivation, and trust. But in dark psychology, it's used for control. A manipulator may reward someone, not for doing what's right, but for doing what benefits them. The praise, affection, or approval is given selectively, based on compliance, not connection. For example, in a toxic relationship, one partner might be cold or distant most of the time, but suddenly warm and generous when the other person gives in or agrees with them. This burst of kindness isn't spontaneous. It's reinforcement. It trains the other person to associate submission with reward. Even if the rest of the relationship is emotionally difficult, that occasional moment of relief keeps the cycle going. This pattern is often referred to as breadcrumbing. Small, unpredictable rewards, like compliments, gifts, or moments of intimacy, are used to keep someone emotionally invested. It creates anticipation and anxiety. The other person starts trying harder, hoping for the next sign of approval. Another example is in the workplace. A manipulative boss might only praise employees when they agree with every decision or take on extra tasks without pushing back. The reward, public recognition, opportunities, or inclusion reinforces loyalty, not honesty. People learn that questioning anything leads to silence or exclusion, while obedience brings praise. What makes positive reinforcement so powerful is that it's rarely questioned. It feels good. It looks kind. But when the reward is used to shape behavior for someone else's benefit, it crosses into manipulation. The person being reinforced might feel like they're making progress or earning trust, but really they're being conditioned to respond in a specific way. This kind of control is hard to spot because it doesn't involve threats or punishments. It's all about timing, consistency, and emotional payoff. The manipulator isn't demanding, they're rewarding. And that makes the influence feel less like control and more like connection. Understanding positive reinforcement means looking beyond the reward itself and asking what it's reinforcing and why. In healthy dynamics, it builds mutual respect and support. In darker ones, it builds dependence and obedience, one reward at a time. Negative reinforcement. In psychology, negative reinforcement is a technique where a discomfort or pressure is taken away once someone does what's expected. The idea is simple. If doing something causes the stress to stop, the person is more likely to keep doing it. It's not about giving a reward. It's about removing a burden. This concept is often confused with punishment, but they're not the same. Punishment adds something unpleasant to discourage behavior. Negative reinforcement removes something unpleasant to increase behavior. It's subtle, and that's exactly why it's powerful, especially in the hands of someone who wants control. Take a basic example. A student who's constantly criticized by a teacher finally turns in an assignment early, and the criticism stops. The relief they feel reinforces the behavior. Now, they're motivated, not by genuine interest or praise, but by the desire to avoid more criticism. In dark psychology, this method is often used in personal relationships. Imagine a situation where someone gives their partner the silent treatment every time they express a different opinion. The silence feels cold, tense, and punishing. Eventually, the partner learns that agreeing, whether sincerely or not, makes the silence stop. That's negative reinforcement. It conditions someone to suppress disagreement just to keep the peace. It also shows up in family dynamics. A parent might create a tense environment whenever rules are questioned. But when the child complies, the tension disappears. Over time, the child learns to obey not out of respect, but because obedience removes stress. The parent hasn't praised them, they've just stopped applying pressure. That relief becomes the motivator. In workplaces, negative reinforcement can be built into team culture. A manager might ignore or criticize employees who speak up with concerns, but stay neutral when they stay quiet. That neutrality, simply not being scolded, can start to feel like a win. Employees adapt, not to do what's right, but to avoid discomfort. Again, behavior is shaped by relief, not encouragement. What makes negative reinforcement so effective in manipulation is that it doesn't look controlling. There's no obvious reward, no open threat. Just a pattern. Stress rises when behavior shifts and vanishes when the manipulator gets what they want. It teaches the other person to adjust, often without realizing it. This tactic is rarely used alone. It's often paired with guilt, gaslighting, or other forms of emotional control. Together, they create an environment where someone feels responsible for keeping everything calm, even if it means giving up their voice or needs. Understanding negative reinforcement helps explain why some people stay quiet, stay agreeable, or stay stuck in unhealthy dynamics. They're not being openly punished, they're just avoiding the stress that kicks in when they don't comply. And in dark psychology, that avoidance becomes a quiet but powerful form of control. Punishment and coercion. Punishment and coercion are two of the most direct tools in dark psychology. They don't rely on subtlety or charm. They work by creating fear, discomfort, or pressure to force someone into doing what the manipulator wants. Punishment is about applying consequences to stop a behavior. It can be loud, like yelling or public embarrassment, or it can be quiet, cold stares, passive aggression, or social exclusion. The goal is to make the behavior so unpleasant to experience that the person avoids doing it again. In dark psychology, punishment isn't used to teach, it's used to control. Coercion is slightly different. Instead of just reacting to behavior, coercion pushes someone to act against their will by threatening negative consequences. It creates a situation where the person doesn't feel free to say no. They may technically have a choice, but the cost of resisting is too high. These tactics show up in many different settings. In personal relationships, punishment might involve emotional outbursts when boundaries are set. A partner might lash out if the other person spends time with friends, pushing them to withdraw from their social circle. Over time, the fear of that punishment becomes enough to shape their behavior without another word being said. In families, punishment can look like constant criticism, withdrawal of affection, or even humiliation disguised as discipline. If a child expresses disagreement and is immediately met with anger or silence, they quickly learn that honesty leads to pain. The lesson isn't about growth, it's about compliance. Coercion often appears in more calculated forms. A partner might say, "If you really love me, you'd do this," implying that saying no means losing the relationship. It's not a direct threat, but the emotional pressure makes refusal feel dangerous. The person gives in, not because they agree, but because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't. In workplaces, coercion can come from above or within teams. A manager might tie job security to unrealistic demands. "If you want to stay here, you'll do this." The employee complies, not out of motivation, but out of fear. Even among co-workers, punishment can take the form of exclusion or gossip, quietly reinforcing which behaviors are acceptable and which aren't. These methods are often mistaken for discipline or strong leadership, especially when they're delivered with calm voices or logical reasoning. But the key difference is the intent. In dark psychology, punishment and coercion aren't used to solve problems, they're used to dominate. The real danger lies in how these tactics reshape behavior over time. People start avoiding conflict, suppressing needs, or agreeing with things they don't believe. Not because they've changed their mind, but because they've been trained to expect pain when they resist. Punishment creates fear. Coercion removes freedom. And in combination, they build an environment where control is maintained not through connection or respect, but through pressure, silence, and compliance. Silent treatment. In dark psychology, the silent treatment is a form of emotional manipulation where one person deliberately ignores or withdraws communication from another to gain control. It's not the same as taking a break during a conflict or needing space to cool down. This is strategic silence designed to punish, provoke guilt, or force compliance. At first glance, it may seem passive. There's no shouting, no accusations, just an abrupt shutdown. But that silence sends a loud message. You did something wrong, and I'm not going to talk to you until you fix it. The person on the receiving end often feels confused, anxious, or desperate to restore the connection, even if they're not sure what they did. This tactic is especially common in close relationships, romantic partners, friends, or family members. It might follow a disagreement, a boundary being set, or simply a refusal to give in to a demand. Instead of having a conversation, the manipulator pulls away emotionally, stops responding, and refuses to engage. The other person is left in an emotional vacuum, trying to interpret the silence and fix the situation, without ever knowing what the rules are. What makes the silent treatment so effective is its ambiguity. There's no clear confrontation, just distance. That forces the targeted person to do the emotional work, to apologize, guess what went wrong, or soften their stance just to get things back to normal. It creates a power imbalance where one person becomes the emotional gatekeeper and the other is stuck trying to earn their way back into good standing. In toxic dynamics, this pattern repeats. The silent treatment becomes a routine response to conflict or resistance. It punishes independence and reinforces compliance. The more someone gives in to break the silence, the more the tactic gets reinforced. Eventually, the person on the receiving end learns to avoid certain topics or behaviors, not because they agree, but because they fear being shut out. In group settings, the silent treatment can also take the form of social exclusion. A colleague might be left out of meetings, conversations, or decisions. It's rarely acknowledged out loud, but the message is clear. Fall in line or be ignored. This kind of subtle isolation puts pressure on people to conform without ever needing to explain why. The silent treatment is often rationalized as just needing space or not wanting to argue. But when silence is used as a pattern of control, it stops being about emotional regulation and starts being about dominance. It shifts the focus from resolving the issue to managing the emotional fallout. Used intentionally, this kind of silence isn't peaceful, it's calculated, it doesn't resolve tension, it creates it. And in dark psychology, that tension is the point. It keeps the other person uncertain, uncomfortable, and more likely to bend just to bring the silence to an end. Guilt tripping. It's a form of emotional manipulation that uses guilt as leverage. Instead of expressing a need or setting a boundary, the guilt tripper delivers a message that says, "If you really cared, you'd do this." The other person isn't just responding to the request. They're responding to the pressure of not wanting to disappoint, upset, or hurt someone they care about. At its core, guilt tripping works because it targets a person's conscience. Most people want to be seen as kind, generous, or loyal. Manipulators know this. They frame situations in ways that make any disagreement or refusal seem selfish or uncaring. It's not about what's fair. It's about what makes the other person feel responsible. A classic example might be a friend who says, "Wow, I guess I just don't matter to you anymore," after being told no. Or a parent who says, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me." These aren't direct arguments. They're emotional hooks. The person isn't asking for a change. They're forcing one by making the other person feel like they've failed in some way. Guilt tripping often shows up in close relationships where emotional bonds run deep. Romantic partners might use it to get more time, attention, or agreement. Family members might use it to maintain control or enforce traditions. Even co-workers or peers might lean on it to shift responsibility or avoid accountability. It's also common in one-sided dynamics. The guilt tripper may constantly demand emotional labor, favors, or support without offering the same in return. When the other person finally sets a boundary, they're made to feel like they're being cold or unreasonable. The guilt isn't based on what actually happened. It's based on how the manipulator wants them to feel. In more strategic cases, guilt tripping is combined with silence, passive aggression, or subtle reminders of past sacrifices. A person might say, "It's fine. I'll just do it myself, like I always do." The words sound harmless, but the implication is heavy. The target is made to feel like they're letting someone down just by prioritizing their own needs. What makes guilt tripping effective is that it's hard to challenge without feeling defensive. Calling it out can sound insensitive, especially if the guilt tripper presents themselves as hurt or misunderstood. This creates a trap. Defend yourself, and you seem cold. Give in, and you reinforce the behavior. Over time, this pattern conditions people to avoid conflict and give in early, just to avoid feeling like the bad guy. It erodes confidence, reshapes boundaries, and makes the relationship feel like an emotional balancing act. Guilt tripping isn't always loud or dramatic. It's often quiet, subtle, and disguised as disappointment. But it's a powerful form of control, one that shifts the focus from mutual respect to emotional debt. And once that debt feels permanent, the guilt becomes harder to ignore. Mind games and subtle control. Mind games are a form of psychological control that don't rely on force, threats, or open confrontation. Instead, they use confusion, mixed signals, and emotional imbalance to wear someone down and steer their behavior. In dark psychology, mind games are deliberate. The person playing them wants control, but in a way that keeps them looking innocent, reasonable, or even caring. The goal isn't just to get a specific reaction. It's to make the other person constantly question what's happening, what's real, and whether they're overthinking it. These tactics often start small. A manipulator might say one thing and do another. They might subtly shift their tone or body language in a way that makes the other person feel like they've done something wrong, even if nothing's been said directly. That uncertainty becomes the first hook. One common example is inconsistent communication. A person may shower you with attention one day, then go completely distant the next, without explanation. When you ask what changed, the response is vague. "I've just been busy," or "you're reading into things." This back and forth keeps the other person guessing and emotionally off balance. It builds a pattern where validation becomes unpredictable and attention feels like a reward to be earned. Another tactic involves selective honesty. The manipulator might share just enough truth to seem trustworthy, but leave out key details or bend the context. They don't lie outright, but they create a version of events that shapes how you see others, yourself, or the relationship. It's control through curation, not force. Subtle control also includes behavior that looks helpful, but is really about dominance. Offering advice that slowly erodes someone's confidence. Giving compliments that sound supportive but contain hidden criticism. For example, "You look great, way better than usual." It creates self-doubt disguised as kindness. In relationships, mind games often revolve around shifting blame. If you express concern, the response might be, "You're just insecure," or "You always take things the wrong way." These aren't answers, they're deflections. The focus moves from the manipulator's behavior to your emotional response. Now you're defending your feelings instead of questioning their actions. Another layer of subtle control is future promises that never materialize. "Things will be different soon. Once this passes, we'll be better." These statements buy time and keep hope alive, but they're rarely backed up by consistent change. The person stays in control by keeping the other emotionally invested, even when nothing improves. What all of these tactics have in common is uncertainty. The person on the receiving end is always second-guessing, always adjusting, always trying to stay in sync. It's not about open conflict, it's about quiet imbalance. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to separate genuine connection from calculated control. Mind games aren't random. They're structured around unpredictability, which creates dependence. The person being manipulated starts relying on the very person who's destabilizing them, because that's the only place they believe clarity or comfort might come from. And that's how subtle control becomes deeply effective without ever raising its voice. Covert emotional manipulation. Covert emotional manipulation is one of the most subtle and dangerous forms of control. It's not loud, dramatic, or obvious. It works quietly by shaping how someone feels, thinks, and behaves without them fully realizing it. At its core, covert emotional manipulation is about steering someone's emotions in order to influence their decisions or beliefs. It doesn't use direct threats or commands. Instead, it relies on tactics like guilt, confusion, self-doubt, and obligation. The manipulator stays in the background, while the target is left feeling like they're making choices on their own, even though those choices are being engineered. One of the most common forms of covert manipulation is playing the victim. A manipulator may act helpless, hurt, or misunderstood, especially when they're being challenged. By turning the attention to their own emotional pain, they avoid accountability and redirect the conversation. The other person often ends up apologizing or comforting them, even if they were the one being mistreated. Another tactic is emotional withdrawal. This is when the manipulator suddenly pulls back affection, attention, or communication without explanation. The shift feels cold and unexpected. The target starts to worry. Did they do something wrong? Are they being punished? The anxiety that follows often leads them to change their behavior just to restore the connection. The manipulator doesn't need to explain or argue. They let the silence do the work. Subtle guilt tripping is also common. Instead of making direct demands, the manipulator drops hints that make the other person feel guilty for not doing more. It's fine, I'll handle it on my own. Or, I didn't expect you to understand. These comments are framed as passive or even kind, but they carry emotional weight. They shift responsibility without openly assigning blame. Another method is twisting emotional responses. If someone brings up a concern or sets a boundary, the manipulator might say things like, "You're being too sensitive," or "You're overthinking it." These phrases don't address the issue. They undermine the person's ability to trust their own feelings. The goal is to make them doubt their reactions, so they're less likely to challenge the behavior again. Covert manipulation also includes conditional affection. The manipulator is warm, supportive, and kind when things are going their way. But as soon as something doesn't suit them, the tone changes. Affection becomes a reward, not a constant. This trains the other person to avoid conflict, suppress their needs, and focus on keeping the peace. What ties all of these tactics together is that they're hard to prove. There's no clear evidence of wrongdoing. The manipulator rarely raises their voice or gives an obvious command. Instead, they create a dynamic where the other person begins to question their own feelings, adjust their behavior, and take on more emotional responsibility than is fair. Covert emotional manipulation works because it feels personal. It's built on connection, not intimidation. And that makes it easy to miss and even easier to excuse until the pattern becomes too hard to ignore. Manipulation in relationships. One partner pulls away after an argument. The other scrambles to fix things, apologizing, over-explaining, trying to keep the peace. Nothing is said outright, but the message is clear. Disagreement equals distance. This is how manipulation often works in romantic relationships, not through shouting or ultimatums, but through emotional pressure, subtle tactics, and unspoken consequences. It's about shaping behavior without open conflict, making one partner feel responsible for the other's moods, reactions, and well-being. Manipulation in relationships typically begins with small adjustments. One person expresses discomfort when their partner spends time with friends, not directly, but through guilt, silence, or passive comments. You seem to have time for everyone else. The partner, wanting to avoid tension, cancels plans. Over time, they begin isolating themselves, not because they're asked to, but because they're conditioned to expect fallout when they don't. This kind of control is rarely constant. It comes in cycles. After conflict or coldness, there may be warmth, affection, even apologies. The inconsistency creates confusion and emotional dependency. The person on the receiving end begins to second-guess their instincts. They don't want to risk triggering distance or withdrawal again, so they adjust. They accommodate. Not out of agreement, but out of fear of emotional consequences. Another common tactic is selective vulnerability. The manipulative partner shares deep feelings or painful experiences, but only when they need to redirect attention or avoid accountability. For example, if their partner expresses concern about being ignored, they might respond with a story about how they've always felt abandoned. The topic shifts. The partner feels guilty for bringing it up. Their need gets buried under someone else's narrative. There's also the use of exaggerated comparisons. You're starting to act just like my ex. I've never had to deal with this in other relationships. These statements are designed to create doubt and pressure the other person to behave differently. Instead of discussing the issue, the manipulator undermines their partner's sense of normalcy. Even compliments can carry hidden weight. You're the only one who really gets me. I'd be lost without you. These lines sound sweet, but when repeated alongside controlling behavior, they set the stage for emotional responsibility. The partner begins to feel like they can't speak up, leave, or even express discomfort, because they've been made to believe they're the stabilizing force in someone else's life. In more controlling relationships, manipulation escalates into tracking, monitoring, or constant suspicion, framed as love or concern. Questions like, "Who are you texting?" or "Why didn't you answer right away?" become routine. Each challenge to independence is justified as care, but the result is the same. Control wrapped in emotional reasoning. Manipulation in romantic relationships is rarely about one explosive moment. It's a slow, steady erosion of boundaries, framed as love, concern, or compatibility. And it works not because the manipulator is always aggressive, but because they're often just convincing enough to seem reasonable, while making the other person do all the emotional work. Manipulation in friendships. A friend jokes about you in front of others. You laugh it off, but something feels off. Later they say, "You know I'm just teasing." The comment stays with you longer than the laugh did. Manipulation in friendships is often subtle. It hides behind humor, support, loyalty, and shared history. Unlike romantic relationships, where control might be easier to spot, manipulation among friends usually blends into everyday interactions. It doesn't look like control. It looks like closeness, until it starts to feel one-sided. At its core, manipulation in friendships involves using emotional influence to steer someone's behavior, decisions, or boundaries without their full awareness. It's not about honest disagreement or occasional conflict. It's about shaping someone's responses in a way that benefits one person at the cost of the other's comfort or clarity. One common form is emotional guilt tripping. A friend might make you feel bad for setting a boundary or saying no. "I just thought you'd be there for me. I guess you're too busy now that you've got new people." These statements aren't direct requests, they're emotional hooks. They're meant to push you into compliance, not through conversation, but through guilt. Another tactic is constant one-upmanship, or subtle put-downs. A manipulative friend may always have a bigger problem, a more important story, or a way to shift attention back to themselves. Or they might regularly mock your preferences or ideas under the disguise of being playful. "You're really wearing that?" Or, "You always overthink everything." Over time, these comments chip away at confidence. You may start editing yourself just to keep the peace. Passive aggression is another layer. Instead of openly expressing frustration or disagreement, the manipulator uses sarcasm, delayed responses, or social exclusion to signal disapproval. You might not be directly criticized, but you can feel the tension. You're left to interpret what went wrong and adjust your behavior accordingly. Faux vulnerability is another method, when a friend shares personal struggles not to connect, but to control. If you bring up your own concerns, they may pivot the conversation back to their pain, or suggest you're being unsupportive. This creates an imbalance where the friendship constantly revolves around their emotional needs. In some dynamics, the manipulative friend positions themselves as your only true ally. They subtly discourage you from spending time with others or speak poorly about mutual friends behind their backs. They don't really get you like I do. You've changed since you started hanging out with them. This form of isolation doesn't always cut you off completely, but it makes you question your other connections. What makes manipulation in friendships especially hard to detect is the emotional familiarity. These are people you trust, people who've been there for you, people who know what matters to you. That history gives them influence, and when used unfairly, it turns friendship into a form of leverage. Manipulation in friendships doesn't always come from bad intentions. But when patterns of guilt, control, or imbalance go unchallenged, even the closest bonds can become emotionally draining. And recognizing those patterns is the first step toward restoring a friendship, or knowing when to walk away from one. Manipulation in the workplace. A manager praises your work in public, but criticizes it in private. A colleague takes credit for your idea, then casually says, "We're all on the same team." You're left wondering if you're overreacting or just being outplayed. Manipulation in the workplace doesn't always look like outright sabotage. Often, it takes the form of subtle influence, selective communication, and strategic behavior designed to protect one person's power or advance their position at someone else's expense. It's about controlling perception, access, and outcomes without appearing aggressive. At its core, workplace manipulation is the use of social pressure, emotional leverage, or misleading behavior to gain advantage. It can come from managers, peers, or even subordinates. And because work environments rely on collaboration and hierarchy, it's easy for manipulation to be disguised as leadership, teamwork, or company loyalty. One common tactic is withholding information. A manipulator might leave out key details in a meeting or delay sharing updates, then point out your mistake when you're caught unaware. This keeps them in control of what others know, while making it harder for you to perform confidently or speak up. Credit stealing is another frequent move. A team member might present your idea as theirs or subtly insert themselves into your success story. If challenged, they'll often downplay it. "I thought we came up with that together." The goal isn't always recognition, it's positioning, staying in the spotlight without having to do all the work. Then there's emotional manipulation, especially from those in positions of authority. A manager might frame unrealistic demands as personal favors. "I just really need your help on this." Or they might use guilt. "Everyone else has already stayed late." These statements don't leave much room to say no, even if the request is unfair. Some people use triangulation, playing co-workers against each other while staying neutral on the surface. They might share selective comments or create tension between team members to weaken group cohesion. The result is a fractured team that relies more on the manipulator for guidance, which only increases their influence. Public praise, private pressure is another pattern. A supervisor may compliment someone's work in front of others to maintain appearances, but behind closed doors, they micromanage, criticize, or use fear to motivate. This creates a confusing dynamic where the employee feels unsteady, unsure whether to trust what's said or what's done. Overpromising and underdelivering is a long-term strategy some use to maintain loyalty. Promises of promotion, raises, or new opportunities are made just often enough to keep people hopeful, but never concrete enough to follow through. This tactic keeps employees invested, compliant, and hesitant to question leadership. What makes workplace manipulation especially challenging is that it often hides behind professional language, policy, or performance reviews. It's not always personal, it's strategic. And because speaking up can carry risks, many people adapt quietly rather than confront the behavior directly. Understanding how manipulation operates in the workplace isn't just about spotting bad actors. It's about recognizing patterns of influence that shape how decisions are made, credit is given, and power is maintained, especially when those patterns are designed to be overlooked. Elements of persuasion. You don't need to shout to change someone's mind. Most persuasion happens quietly, through tone, timing, and trust. Persuasion is the process of influencing someone's thoughts, feelings, or actions. It's not about forcing a decision, it's about guiding one. In everyday life, persuasion is everywhere. Ads that make you consider a product, co-workers convincing you to join a project, or friends shaping how you see a situation. But beneath the surface, effective persuasion relies on specific psychological elements that shape how people respond. One of the most important elements is credibility. People are more likely to be persuaded by someone they see as knowledgeable, trustworthy, or experienced. This isn't just about facts. It's about how confident and consistent someone appears. A person who speaks clearly, backs up their claims, and remains calm under pressure is seen as more persuasive, even if their message is simple. Another key factor is liking. We're more open to influence from people we like, admire, or relate to. That's why marketers use friendly faces, relatable stories, or charismatic spokespeople. In personal conversations, this shows up as warmth, shared interests, or humor. The more connected we feel, the more receptive we become. Reciprocity also plays a big role. When someone gives us something, help, attention, compliments, we often feel a subtle pressure to give something back. This doesn't have to be manipulative, but in darker contexts, it can be used to create a sense of obligation. For example, someone might do you a favor so they can ask for one later, knowing you'll be more likely to say yes. Social proof is another powerful element. People tend to follow the crowd, especially in uncertain situations. When we see others doing something, we assume it's the correct or accepted behavior. That's why reviews, testimonials, and group consensus are so influential. If everyone else seems convinced, we feel safer agreeing. Then there's scarcity, the idea that things become more valuable when they're limited. This plays on urgency and fear of missing out. Sales that end at midnight, limited time offers, or only 2 spots left messages are all designed to make decisions feel more immediate and important. Scarcity pushes us to act quickly, sometimes before we've had time to think clearly. Authority also impacts how we respond. People are more likely to trust and follow those they perceive as experts or leaders. Uniforms, titles, and confident delivery all enhance this effect. In persuasive situations, even small cues, like tone of voice or posture, can shift how much weight we give to someone's words. Lastly, consistency matters. When someone makes a small commitment, like agreeing with a simple idea, they're more likely to agree with larger, related ideas later. This is known as the foot-in-the-door technique. It works because people want their actions to match their identity. If they've said yes once, they're more likely to say yes again to stay consistent. Each of these elements, credibility, liking, reciprocity, social proof, scarcity, authority, and consistency, can be used ethically or manipulatively. But in dark psychology, they're often layered and timed for maximum influence, shaping decisions without ever making it obvious that persuasion is happening at all. Emotional leverage. Someone shares a painful story right before asking for a favor. You hesitate, but saying no now feels uncomfortable, even unfair. That's emotional leverage. It's the use of emotional weight, like guilt, fear, sympathy, or loyalty, to gain influence over someone's choices. Unlike open negotiation or direct persuasion, emotional leverage works by shifting how the other person feels, so they become easier to steer without realizing they're being steered. At its core, emotional leverage turns feelings into currency. It uses past experiences, personal connection, or vulnerability as a tool, not necessarily to build trust, but to create pressure. This tactic isn't always malicious, but in the wrong hands, it becomes a powerful way to bypass logic and override boundaries. One common example is guilt. Someone might remind you of how much they've done for you, especially when they want something in return. After everything I've helped you through, you can't do this one thing for me? It's not a question. It's a setup. The logic doesn't matter anymore. What matters is how you'll feel if you say no. Another form is strategic vulnerability. This happens when someone shares their struggles, not to connect, but to create an emotional opening. If you try to set a boundary or say something difficult, they respond with a story about how hard things have been lately. You're not just navigating a conversation anymore, you're navigating their pain, and that shifts the balance of power. Fear is also used as leverage, not fear of physical harm, but fear of rejection, conflict, or disapproval. In relationships, a partner might say, "If you really love me, you'll do this." In workplaces, a boss might imply that turning down an extra task could affect your future with the company. These aren't outright threats, but they rely on emotional pressure to produce compliance. Some people use affection as leverage. They give warmth, praise, or attention when things go their way, and withdraw it when they don't. Over time, this creates a reward and punishment system based on feelings. The person being manipulated starts to chase emotional approval and avoids anything that might disrupt it. In more complex situations, emotional leverage can involve shared secrets, past mistakes, or personal insecurities. The manipulator knows what matters to the other person and what might cause them shame, fear, or hesitation. These soft spots become tools, not through blackmail, but through emotional framing. I just don't want you to make the same mistake again. You know how you get when you're stressed? Comments like these steer behavior without needing to be direct. What makes emotional leverage so effective is that it's hard to recognize in the moment. The conversation feels personal. The relationship feels real. But slowly, decisions are being shaped less by choice and more by emotional pressure. And once those patterns set in, it becomes easier for the manipulator to lead and harder for the other person to step back and see what's really going on. Subliminal tactics. You walk into a room and instantly feel tense, but you can't quite explain why. No one said anything wrong. Nothing looks out of place. Still, something feels off. That's the kind of space where subliminal tactics operate best. They're not about direct orders or obvious persuasion. They're about influence that slips under the surface, nudging your thoughts, feelings, or behaviors without you fully realizing it. Subliminal tactics rely on subtle cues, patterns, or triggers that work just below conscious awareness. The goal isn't to deliver a clear message. It's to shape perception quietly so people make decisions or feel emotions that seem like their own. In marketing, this might involve colors, sounds, or images placed strategically. In interpersonal dynamics, it's more often about tone, repetition, or environmental control. One simple example is strategic wording. Instead of saying, "You should trust me," someone might say, "Most people find I'm easy to trust." That small shift removes direct pressure and frames the idea as common sense. It feels safer to agree because it doesn't sound like a request. It sounds like a fact. Repetition is another core tool. Hearing the same idea multiple times, even if casually dropped in conversation, can make it feel familiar and true. A manager who repeats, "We're all just lucky to have jobs right now," can slowly shape a workplace mindset where overwork is accepted and questioned less often. No one forces agreement. It's just woven into the environment. Visual cues can also carry subliminal weight. A leader might position themselves at the head of the table, speak slightly louder, or make eye contact just a moment longer than others. These details create a subtle hierarchy without announcing one. The people around them begin responding to the energy, not the words. In relationships, subliminal tactics often show up as controlled chaos. A partner may keep plans vague, change topics frequently, or react emotionally to simple questions. Over time, this creates an environment where the other person is always slightly unsure of what's happening, what's expected, or what the rules are. That confusion lowers resistance and makes subtle control easier to maintain. Another technique is anchoring, where one experience is repeatedly linked to a certain response. If someone always praises you after you agree with them, but stays cold when you don't, your brain starts associating agreement with relief. You're not being told to comply. You're just learning, unconsciously, what feels better. Even background choices, music, lighting, pacing, can affect mood and openness to suggestion. In darker uses of psychology, people might tailor settings or conversations to maximize emotional suggestibility. For example, making someone feel flattered or vulnerable before introducing a request. Subliminal tactics are powerful because they don't feel manipulative. They don't interrupt. They don't argue. They blend into normal life, into phrasing, habits, and shared spaces, guiding thoughts and choices without ever making it obvious that someone's doing the guiding. And that's what makes them so effective. They don't need permission, just attention that no one realizes they've given. Reciprocity. Someone does you a favor, even if you didn't ask for it. Part of you feels the need to return it. That's reciprocity. It's one of the most basic social rules we follow. When someone gives, we feel obligated to give back. This principle exists across cultures and relationships. It helps build trust, cooperation, and a sense of fairness. But in dark psychology, that same instinct can be used to manipulate behavior without ever making a direct demand. At its core, reciprocity is about balance. If someone offers help, support, or kindness, it creates a kind of emotional debt. You might not owe them money or a favor in return, but you feel the pressure to even the score. In healthy situations, this leads to mutual respect. But when used strategically, it becomes a tool for control. One of the simplest examples is the unsolicited favor. Someone goes out of their way to do something for you, offers guidance, a gift, or emotional support. You didn't ask for it, and maybe you didn't even need it. But now that it's been given, there's an unspoken expectation. When they later ask for something, it's harder to say no. Turning them down doesn't feel like declining a request. It feels like breaking a rule. In sales, reciprocity shows up all the time. Free samples, limited time discounts, even compliments can all create a sense of obligation. A vendor might say, "I'm only offering this deal to you." That small act of perceived generosity makes customers more likely to agree because they feel like they've already been given something. In personal relationships, reciprocity can be used more quietly. A partner might constantly point out everything they do for you. "I cooked dinner again." "I've been listening to you vent all week." These aren't complaints, they're reminders. The more visible their contributions, the more it shifts the emotional balance. You begin to feel guilty for pushing back, even if your concerns are valid. Some manipulators use overgiving as a long-term strategy. Early in a relationship, they might be extremely generous with time, affection, or support. It builds trust quickly and creates a growing sense that you owe them. Later, if they make unreasonable demands or cross a boundary, you're less likely to speak up. You're carrying the weight of everything they've done for you. Even apologies can carry hidden expectations. Someone wrongs you, then apologizes with a grand gesture, publicly, emotionally, or through a gift. You're expected to forgive, move on, or stop bringing it up. If you don't, you're made to feel ungrateful. The original issue gets buried under the pressure to accept the act of restitution. Reciprocity isn't inherently manipulative. It's a natural part of human connection. But when one side uses it as leverage, offering just enough to make refusal uncomfortable, it shifts from social glue to psychological trap. It changes how we weigh decisions, not through facts or logic, but through feelings of fairness we didn't agree to, but still feel. Commitment and consistency. You say yes to a small request. Later, you find yourself agreeing to something much bigger, just to stay consistent. That's commitment and consistency. It's a psychological principle that describes our natural tendency to align future behavior with past choices. Once we take a position, especially in public or in writing, we feel internal pressure to stay consistent with that decision, even when circumstances change. This isn't about logic. It's about identity. People want to appear stable, reliable, and clear-minded. When we commit to something, we start to see ourselves in a certain light. The more public or deliberate the commitment, the more pressure we feel to act in ways that match it. Backing out doesn't just mean changing plans. It can feel like admitting we were wrong, indecisive, or inconsistent. This idea is often used in subtle ways. One common example is the foot-in-the-door technique. A person starts by asking for something small, like signing a petition, answering a survey, or helping with a quick task. Once you've said yes, they follow up with a larger request. Because you've already shown willingness, saying no now feels harder. You're motivated to maintain the image you've just presented. Helpful, supportive, involved. In sales, this shows up when a customer expresses early interest in a product. Would you like to try a sample? Can I show you just one option? These aren't final decisions, but once the customer says yes to the first step, it creates a sense of progress. Backing out starts to feel like undoing something rather than simply declining. In relationships, commitment and consistency can be used to steer behavior over time. For example, someone might ask for a small concession. Can you just check in when you get there? Later, that check-in becomes expected. Then it becomes multiple check-ins. Each step builds on the last. Because the earlier agreements felt reasonable, the new ones are harder to reject, despite being more demanding. This principle also works with written or public commitments. If someone posts online about their goals or beliefs, they're more likely to follow through. Not necessarily because they believe more strongly, but because they don't want to appear inconsistent. This is why advertisers encourage customer testimonials or loyalty programs. Once people declare support, they're more likely to justify and maintain it. Manipulators often use commitment and consistency to their advantage by framing early agreements as harmless. Once those are in place, they slowly introduce larger expectations. Each step is justified by the one before it. It doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like follow-through. What makes this tactic powerful is that it works without threats or rewards. It relies on internal pressure, the need to feel like we're acting in line with who we are or who we said we were. And once that image is out there, many people will go to great lengths to preserve it, even when it no longer serves them. Social proof. A crowded restaurant feels more appealing than an empty one without knowing anything about the food. That's social proof. It's the idea that people tend to follow the actions, choices, or opinions of others when deciding what to do. When we see a group of people behaving a certain way, we assume they know something we don't. It's a mental shortcut that helps us make decisions more quickly, especially in unfamiliar or uncertain situations. Social proof shows up in everyday life. Online reviews, bestseller lists, influencer endorsements. These all signal that something is popular, trusted, or valued by others. And when we're unsure, those signals are hard to ignore. We tend to believe that if enough people are doing something, it must be the right thing. This principle becomes even more powerful when the group seems similar to us. If people our age, background, or profession are making a particular choice, we're more likely to follow suit. The behavior feels not just popular, but relatable. That's why targeted testimonials or curated reviews work so well. They don't just show approval, they show familiarity. In marketing, social proof is used constantly. Ads highlight how many customers a product has. Websites display phrases like most popular choice or trending now. None of these features explain why something is good. They just show that others are interested. That's often enough to generate trust and drive action. In group settings, social proof can steer behavior without anyone saying a word. If everyone in a meeting nods at an idea, the one person with doubts might stay silent. Not because they agree, but because it feels risky to be the outlier. The group's reaction becomes a cue for what's acceptable, even if it's never made explicit. This also plays out in emergency situations. If someone collapses on a busy street and nobody reacts, others are less likely to step in. It's not because people don't care. It's because everyone is looking to everyone else to decide what the normal reaction is. This is called pluralistic ignorance, a form of social proof where silence signals safety, even when action is needed. Manipulators can exploit social proof by fabricating or exaggerating consensus. Fake followers, inflated reviews, or staged enthusiasm can all create the illusion that something is widely accepted. Once that perception is in place, real people begin to follow, believing the approval is authentic. The behavior spreads, even if the original spark was artificial. Social proof doesn't rely on logic or persuasion, it relies on observation. We watch what others are doing and we adjust, sometimes to fit in, sometimes to feel safe, and sometimes just to avoid uncertainty. It doesn't guarantee the right choice, but it does make certain choices feel easier, more confident, and less risky. And when used deliberately, it becomes a quiet but powerful tool for influence. Authority. A person in a lab coat gives instructions, and people follow, even when those instructions feel wrong. That's the power of authority. It's not about physical force or persuasion. It's about perceived legitimacy. When someone is seen as an expert, leader, or figure of power, their words carry more weight, sometimes more than they should. Authority shapes behavior through signals we've been conditioned to recognize. Titles, uniforms, status, tone of voice. These all influence how we respond. We associate authority with credibility, control, and knowledge. And in many situations, following authority is efficient. It keeps organizations running, simplifies decisions, and creates structure. But it also opens the door to manipulation when authority is used to override judgment. In professional environments, authority is often tied to hierarchy. A manager gives feedback, and employees listen. A doctor recommends treatment, and patients comply. In both cases, the authority figure is assumed to know best. That assumption speeds up trust, but it also lowers scrutiny. This effect intensifies when authority is paired with confidence. Someone who speaks firmly, makes eye contact, or uses specific language is more likely to be believed, even if they're wrong. The style of delivery becomes part of the authority itself. In sales, authority is used to build trust quickly. Brands use experts, endorsements, or certifications to lend credibility. Dentists recommend it. Tested in clinical trials. The goal isn't to explain in detail, it's to signal expertise and bypass hesitation. In personal relationships, authority shows up in less obvious ways. One person may claim to know better based on age, experience, or emotional intelligence. They position themselves as the voice of reason, subtly discouraging disagreement. Over time, the dynamic becomes one-sided, with one person leading and the other deferring, not because they lack insight, but because they've been conditioned to doubt it. The danger of unchecked authority is compliance without thinking. People may follow instructions even when they conflict with their values, simply because they believe the person in charge knows best. History is full of examples where obedience led to harm, not because people wanted to hurt others, but because they believed they weren't supposed to question someone in a higher role. Some manipulators deliberately adopt the appearance of authority to gain influence. They dress the part, speak with certainty, and present themselves as experts. This performance creates a shortcut to trust. Once the authority is accepted, it can be used to steer behavior, shape beliefs, and silence doubts. What makes authority so effective is that it often feels responsible. We trust those who seem to know more or have more power. We assume they've earned their position. But when authority is used to control rather than guide, it becomes a tool of manipulation, one that works not through pressure or deception, but through the quiet expectation that we listen, agree, and obey. Liking. We're more likely to say yes to someone we like, even if we don't fully agree with them. That's the principle of liking. It's a powerful psychological trigger that shapes decisions, often without us realizing it. When someone seems friendly, familiar, or relatable, we become more open to their suggestions, requests, or influence. It's not about logic, it's about comfort. People listen more to those they feel good around. Liking can be based on a range of subtle cues. Physical appearance is one of them. Studies show that people who are considered attractive are often seen as more trustworthy, competent, and persuasive, regardless of their actual skills. This doesn't mean people are shallow. It means that appearance affects perception before reason has a chance to step in. Similarity is another key factor. We tend to like people who seem like us, those who share our background, values, hobbies, or even mannerisms. When someone mirrors our tone or gestures in a conversation, it builds a sense of connection. That connection increases the chances that we'll agree with them, support them, or let our guard down. Compliments also play a major role. Flattery, even when we suspect it's insincere, still works. A salesperson who says, "You really know what you're looking for," is doing more than being polite. They're building rapport. That sense of being seen or understood creates a warmer impression, which increases compliance later. In marketing, liking is everywhere. Brands use familiar faces, upbeat voices, or relatable characters to make ads feel more human. Influencers are paid not just because they have an audience, but because that audience likes them. When someone trusted or admired recommends a product, the endorsement feels personal, even when it's paid. In darker uses, liking becomes a tool for manipulation. A person might build rapport quickly to disarm suspicion. They appear friendly, attentive, and agreeable. But once that trust is established, they use it to gain compliance or shift expectations. It's the friendliness, not the facts, that lower resistance. This is often seen in scams or high-pressure sales. The manipulator leads with charm. They ask about your family, find common ground, maybe share a joke. None of it feels pushy. But when the ask finally comes, it's harder to say no, not because it makes sense, but because the interaction has become emotionally anchored in positive feelings. Even in relationships, liking can be used as leverage. A person may go out of their way to be agreeable or entertaining, not to connect, but to increase their influence. When conflict arises later, that early likability is used as a shield. But I've always been good to you. The goal is to make criticism feel unfair, not because the behavior was right, but because the person seemed likable. Liking shapes choices by shaping perception. When someone makes us feel good, we give them more space in our minds and more power in our decisions. It's not just about who they are, it's about how they make us feel. And in the right hands, that feeling becomes a silent, persuasive force. Scarcity. A product is marked only 2 left in stock, and suddenly it feels more valuable, even if you weren't planning to buy it. That's scarcity. It's the psychological effect that makes something seem more desirable simply because it's limited. When access to an item, opportunity, or person is restricted, our brain interprets it as more important. The logic is simple. If it's rare, it must be worth having. Scarcity works because it taps into urgency and fear of loss. It doesn't matter whether the limitation is real or manufactured. The emotional response is the same. We start focusing less on whether we actually want something and more on the risk of missing out. That shift in mindset makes it harder to weigh decisions calmly. There are a few common ways scarcity is used. One of the most obvious is limited time offers, sales that end at midnight, discounts that disappear in a few hours, countdown timers on websites. These tactics don't just advertise deals, they create pressure. The shorter the window, the faster people feel they need to act. Then there's limited quantity. Whether it's concert tickets, collectibles, or exclusive products, being told that only a few are available increases appeal. People assume others will want it too, and that competition means quality. The fear isn't just that we'll miss out, it's that everyone else will get something we didn't. In social dynamics, scarcity applies to attention and access. Someone who is rarely available, doesn't respond right away, or sets strong boundaries may appear more desirable. Their time feels more valuable, not necessarily because they're more interesting, but because they're less reachable. That gap between what's offered and what's available creates a stronger emotional pull. Scarcity also plays out in relationships and communication. A person might intentionally pull back to create distance, knowing that unpredictability makes others lean in. It's not a coincidence. When responses are inconsistent or selective, people often try harder to win attention or approval. The scarcity of emotional availability drives up perceived worth. Marketers and manipulators know that scarcity doesn't have to be real, it just has to feel real. A website may say, 20 people are viewing this now, or only 3 spots left, even if the numbers are inflated. The appearance of demand creates urgency. When paired with a ticking clock or a disappearing bonus, that urgency becomes a strong motivator. What makes scarcity so effective is that it changes how we think. It narrows focus, increases emotional investment, and pushes decisions faster than we're used to making them. It works across industries, relationships, and daily life, not because it offers more, but because it offers less time, less access, less certainty. That perceived lack creates value. And in the hands of someone who understands human behavior, scarcity isn't just a marketing tool, it's a way to guide attention, influence priorities, and quietly take control of the decision-making process. Brainwashing Explained. A belief doesn't need to be forced to take hold. Sometimes it just needs to be repeated in the right setting, over and over, until it starts to feel like your own. Brainwashing is the process of systematically reshaping someone's thinking, usually by breaking down their original identity and replacing it with a new one. It's not about convincing someone through argument. It's about creating a psychological environment where resistance becomes difficult and eventually unnecessary. The method usually follows a clear pattern. First, it creates instability. A person is placed in a situation where their usual way of thinking doesn't work. That could involve cutting them off from outside influences, flooding them with conflicting messages, or making them doubt their past choices. This disorientation is the foundation, because when someone feels uncertain, they become more open to outside direction. The next step is emotional manipulation. The person is made to feel guilty, ashamed, or afraid, then given relief when they accept the new ideas being introduced. Positive reinforcement is used strategically. Agree and you're praised. Resist and you're isolated, criticized, or made to feel ungrateful. The emotional reward isn't for independent thought, it's for compliance. Then comes behavior shaping. Daily routines are controlled, schedules are strict, repetition becomes the norm. When your time, language, and relationships are all tied to a new belief system, your mind starts to shift with your environment. The person's original sense of self fades, not through force, but through constant exposure. In cults, these techniques are especially visible. Recruits are love-bombed, then isolated. They're told who they can speak to, what materials to read, and how to interpret every thought they have. Questioning the group is framed as a personal flaw. Doubt means disloyalty. The longer they stay, the more natural the system feels, until leaving it no longer feels like a choice. But this process isn't limited to cults. Versions of it appear in toxic workplaces, controlling relationships, and even certain political or ideological groups. Any environment that uses repetition, isolation, guilt, and reward to overwrite your thoughts is applying the same psychological pattern, just at a different scale. Language plays a big role too. Brainwashing often introduces loaded phrases or slogans that reshape how people think. Words like betrayal, awakening, or purity carry emotional weight and reduce complex ideas to simple categories. Once that language sets in, thinking outside the system becomes harder, not just socially, but mentally. The final stage is internalization. After enough repetition, the person no longer needs to be told what to think. The beliefs feel familiar, comfortable, and personal, even if they were once completely foreign. At that point, external control becomes internal, and that's when brainwashing is complete. Not when someone acts differently, but when they believe they've chosen to. Mental conditioning techniques. A person doesn't need to be told what to believe every day. They just need to be shown the same message often enough, until it becomes the default way they think. That's the basis of mental conditioning. It's the use of repetition, reinforcement, and environment to shape how someone reacts, decides, and perceives the world around them. These techniques don't force beliefs. They slowly train the mind to adopt them as normal. Mental conditioning is everywhere. It's used in education, military training, therapy, advertising, and sports. But in dark psychology, the same techniques are used with a different motive, not to empower, but to control. The most basic form is classical conditioning, where two things become mentally linked through repetition. If a person hears a sound right before being given a reward, their brain starts to connect the sound with pleasure. Eventually, just the sound triggers a response. In manipulation, this might look like pairing affection with obedience, rewarding agreement with warmth, and punishing independence with silence or coldness. The target isn't told what to think. They're conditioned to feel good only when they're compliant. Then there's operant conditioning, which uses consequences to shape behavior. Positive reinforcement encourages repetition, like praise, attention, or approval. Negative reinforcement removes discomfort, like ending the silent treatment once someone apologizes. Over time, people learn what behaviors lead to peace or reward and what behaviors bring tension. They adjust without needing to be told. Priming is another subtle method. It works by exposing someone to specific words, images, or themes in advance. So when they face a decision, their brain is already tilted in a certain direction. For example, repeatedly hearing phrases like, "You're lucky I'm patient," can plant the idea that patience is being extended, whether or not the situation actually requires it. The target starts to see themselves as someone who needs managing, and the manipulator as someone offering tolerance. Desensitization also plays a role. If someone is exposed to a harmful behavior in small doses, verbal jabs, minor control, subtle isolation, they're more likely to tolerate it over time. What once seemed unacceptable starts to feel routine. The manipulator gradually pushes the line, knowing the brain adapts to repeated discomfort if it's slow enough. Routine and repetition are critical. The more often someone hears or experiences a certain idea, the more natural it feels. A controlling partner might repeat the same criticisms until the target starts to believe them. A leader might reinforce a message daily until it becomes group truth. Repetition isn't just persuasive, it rewires expectations. All of this happens quietly. Mental conditioning doesn't rely on shouting or threats. It uses structure, timing, and consistency to program emotional responses. The target might still feel like they're making their own choices, but those choices are now happening within boundaries that someone else designed. And once those patterns are in place, the behavior continues, long after the conditioning stops. Isolation and repetition. Someone hears the same idea every day, but only from one voice. Over time, that idea starts to feel like the truth. That's the effect of isolation and repetition. These two techniques work hand in hand to reshape how someone thinks and sees the world. Isolation cuts off alternative viewpoints. Repetition reinforces a single message until it feels familiar, safe, and convincing. Used together, these tools are common in propaganda, cult dynamics, and abusive relationships. But they don't always involve shouting or overt control. Most of the time, they operate quietly through structure, routine, and emotional pressure. Isolation begins by reducing exposure to outside influence. This doesn't have to be physical. It can mean discouraging conversations with certain people, discrediting outsiders, or creating an us versus them mentality. The goal is to limit access to different opinions or new information. When someone's environment becomes socially or emotionally closed off, they start relying on whatever voice remains the most constant. This happens in controlling relationships, where one partner slowly distances the other from friends and family. It happens in groups where outside media is discouraged and internal language becomes more dominant. In both cases, the target doesn't just lose contact with people, they lose context. Their sense of what's normal, safe, or true begins to shift. Once isolation is in place, repetition takes over. The same ideas, phrases, or values are repeated until they no longer feel like beliefs. They feel like facts. Repetition lowers resistance. The more often a message is heard, the more familiar it becomes, and the more likely it is to be accepted without question. This is especially effective when the message is delivered through trusted sources. In a group setting, it might be a leader. In a relationship, it might be a partner. The source doesn't change, but the message is reinforced through tone, timing, and consistency. You're lucky to be here. Nobody else understands you like we do. These aren't just words. They're part of a larger system of mental conditioning. Repetition also works by wearing down critical thinking. A person might question something the first time they hear it, but the 5th or 10th time, they stop challenging it. Not because it's more convincing, but because it's familiar. The brain conserves energy by accepting what's repeated often. This is called the mere exposure effect. The more we're exposed to something, the more we tend to believe it's true. In more extreme environments, repetition can become part of a ritual, daily affirmations, chants, or shared language that gets repeated in group settings. These practices reinforce unity and drown out doubt. They're not just habits. They're tools for anchoring belief through rhythm and routine. When someone is isolated, their emotional needs, like connection, reassurance, or belonging, are met by a limited source. And when that source uses repetition, it doesn't just influence, it shapes. It frames the world in a specific way, then repeats it until the mind stops resisting and starts absorbing. Use of fear and guilt. Someone's told that if they speak up, they'll ruin everything, or that if they leave, they're abandoning someone who needs them. That's fear and guilt at work. These aren't just emotions, they're tools. In manipulation, fear is used to keep people frozen, and guilt is used to make them move, but only in one direction, toward compliance. Fear works by creating consequences, whether real or imagined. A manipulator doesn't need to issue a direct threat. All they have to do is frame disagreement, independence, or change as dangerous. If you do that, you'll lose everything. You don't know what kind of trouble you'll cause. These warnings sound like concern, but they're designed to instill doubt and hesitation. The target begins to associate action with danger and inaction with safety. This technique often appears in personal relationships. A partner might say, "If you leave, I don't know what I'll do to myself," implying that the other person will be to blame for any fallout. The actual threat is buried under emotion, but it's effective. It replaces free choice with emotional risk. In groups or organizations, fear is often tied to identity. Members are told that the outside world is hostile, that doubters are corrupt, or that leaving means betrayal. Even if the rules feel unfair, the fear of being cast out or painted as the enemy keeps people quiet. They stay not out of agreement, but out of survival. Guilt works differently. It focuses not on what might happen, but on what's already been done, or what someone hasn't done. It says, "Look at how much I've done for you. After everything I've sacrificed, this is how you repay me?" These lines aren't about discussion. They're about creating debt. Guilt manipulates by shifting responsibility. The target starts to believe that their own needs or decisions are selfish. They're not just making a choice. They're letting someone down. This emotional weight keeps them in place, constantly trying to make up for something they never agreed to carry. Together, fear and guilt create a loop. Fear says, "Don't act, or something bad will happen." Guilt says, "If you act, you're a bad person." Either way, the result is control, without force, without debate. This pattern shows up in subtle ways too. A boss might imply that turning down extra work means you're not a team player. A parent might suggest that setting boundaries means you don't care. These aren't arguments. They're emotional cues designed to close off options without saying so directly. What makes these tactics especially effective is that they feel internal. The person being manipulated starts to believe the fear is rational and the guilt is deserved. The pressure no longer needs to come from the outside. It becomes self-sustaining. In dark psychology, fear and guilt aren't just reactions, they're strategies. Used skillfully, they override logic, reduce resistance, and reshape choices from the inside out. Hypnosis Explained. Someone closes their eyes, hears a slow voice, and begins to drift, not asleep, but not fully awake either. That state, somewhere between relaxation and focus, is where hypnosis begins. Hypnosis isn't mind control or magic. It's a psychological process that uses focused attention and suggestion to temporarily change how someone experiences reality. It's been used in therapy, entertainment, and, in darker contexts, manipulation. But no matter the setting, hypnosis typically follows a clear sequence of stages. The first stage is preparation, often called the pre-induction phase. This is where trust is built. The person leading the process, called the hypnotist, sets expectations, explains what will happen, and starts to shape how the subject thinks about the experience. This stage is subtle but essential. A person won't respond to suggestions if they don't feel safe or engaged. The hypnotist's tone, rhythm, and confidence all matter here. They're not just talking, they're guiding the subject's attention and lowering resistance. Next comes induction. This is the process of entering the hypnotic state. It usually involves focusing on something simple, a visual target, a sound, or even the sensation of breathing. The hypnotist uses calm, repetitive language to draw the person inward. The body relaxes. The mind narrows its focus. External distractions begin to fade. The goal isn't sleep. It's a state of concentrated calm, where the conscious mind becomes quiet and more suggestible. After that comes the deepening phase. The hypnotist might count down, use metaphors like going deeper, or guide the subject through imagined sensations, like sinking into a soft chair or floating downward. Each step helps the person move further into a state of trance. At this point, the brain becomes more open to suggestion, not because it's shut off, but because it's less analytical. The usual mental filters that question and resist information are temporarily relaxed. Then comes the suggestion stage. This is where changes are introduced. In therapeutic settings, suggestions might target habits or stress. In more manipulative settings, they might guide perception or behavior. The key here is that suggestions are framed in ways the subject is ready to accept. The hypnotist doesn't force, they lead. And because the subject's focus is heightened and their critical thinking is lowered, suggestions often feel like natural thoughts rather than planted ones. Finally, there's the termination phase, or re-alerting. the hypnotist gradually brings the person back to full awareness, usually by counting up or reversing the deepening process. The subject may feel like they've been away for just a few minutes, even if more time has passed. Once awake, the effects of the suggestions can linger, sometimes subtly, sometimes strongly, depending on the depth of the trance and the person's level of responsiveness. Each of these stages, preparation, induction, deepening, suggestion, and termination, relies on timing, tone, and the subject's willingness to follow along. Hypnosis doesn't remove control, it reshapes focus. And when used deliberately, each stage becomes part of a methodical process that can gently shift perception, belief, or behavior, without a person ever realizing how far they've been guided. Neuro-Linguistic programming. You're in a conversation, and someone mirrors your body language, matches your tone, and suddenly the interaction just flows. You feel heard, even understood. That kind of response doesn't always happen by accident. In some cases, it's the result of a technique called NLP. NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. It's a set of methods designed to influence how people think, feel, and communicate. Developed in the 1970s, NLP is built on the idea that language and behavior are connected to mental patterns, and that by adjusting those patterns, you can change how people experience the world. The term itself breaks down into 3 parts. Neuro refers to the way we process information through our nervous system. Linguistic relates to how language shapes our thoughts and feelings. And programming points to the idea that these patterns can be modified, like updating software on a computer. In practical terms, NLP involves techniques that aim to shift behavior, influence emotions, or improve communication. One of the most common is mirroring, subtly matching someone's posture, gestures, or tone. This isn't about copying, it's about creating rapport. When 2 people move or speak in similar ways, the brain often interprets that as trust or connection. NLP practitioners use this to build influence without needing to say much at all. Another core idea in NLP is anchoring. This involves linking a specific physical or verbal cue to an emotional state. For example, if someone consistently hears encouraging words while feeling confident, their brain starts to connect that phrase with confidence. Later, hearing the same words can trigger the same feeling, even in a completely different setting. There's also a strong focus on language patterns. NLP teaches that certain words and phrases can guide thought. For instance, asking, "What would it be like if you could handle this easily?" subtly plants the suggestion that it's possible, without telling the person what to do. These questions bypass resistance by focusing attention in a specific direction. NLP is often used in therapy, coaching, sales, and negotiation. The techniques are applied to help people overcome phobias, improve habits, or build better relationships. But they're also used in darker ways, especially when the goal is control rather than clarity. A manipulator might use NLP to lead a conversation, gain trust quickly, or introduce ideas without triggering pushback. Another technique is reframing, where a person changes the way a situation is described to alter how it's perceived. Saying "you failed" triggers a different response than saying "you learned something that didn't work." The facts are the same, but the emotional weight is different. This shift in framing can be used to encourage growth or to soften criticism in a way that hides its real intent. While the science behind NLP is debated, its techniques are widely recognized in fields that rely on persuasion. Whether used ethically or not, the methods rely on patterns, how people speak, how they think, and how subtle cues shape behavior. NLP doesn't control the mind. but it does create pathways, ones that can lead, guide, or gently push a person toward a particular direction. Dark applications of NLP. Someone asks a question that sounds casual, but it's loaded in a way that nudges you toward a certain answer. You agree without thinking much about it. That's not luck, it's a tactic. These moments often draw from techniques found in NLP or Neuro-Linguistic programming. While NLP is widely used in coaching, communication, and therapy, it also has a darker side. In the hands of someone with the wrong intent, these methods shift from tools of self-improvement to instruments of subtle control. Dark applications of NLP rely on the same principles as legitimate use, influencing thought through language, body cues, and mental associations. But the difference lies in the purpose. Instead of helping someone gain clarity or confidence, the aim is to bypass resistance, plant ideas, and lead decisions, without the other person realizing what's happening. One of the most common techniques is embedded suggestion. This is when a person hides a directive inside a longer sentence or story. Instead of saying, "Trust me," they might say, "Many people feel they can trust me after just one conversation." The suggestion is present, but it's camouflaged. It's not delivered as a demand. It's something the listener is meant to absorb naturally. Another tactic is pacing and leading. The speaker begins with a series of true, observable statements. You're sitting here, listening to this, hearing my voice. The listener's brain agrees with these facts. Then, the speaker adds a suggestion, and you might start to feel more comfortable with what I'm saying. Because the earlier statements were accurate, the listener's mind is primed to accept the final one, even if it's subjective or manipulative. Mirroring is also used, not to build genuine rapport, but to create artificial closeness. A manipulator might copy someone's posture, speech rhythm, or breathing pattern. These small signals trigger a sense of familiarity and connection. Once trust is built, it's easier to introduce suggestions or guide decisions under the radar. Anchoring becomes a manipulation tool when it's used to connect specific words or gestures with emotional responses. For instance, a person might use a certain tone or phrase whenever they offer reassurance. Later, they can trigger the same emotional reaction simply by repeating that tone or phrase, even when delivering something entirely different, like a demand or criticism. Perhaps most powerful is reframing, especially when it's used to distort reality. A controlling person might redefine resistance as betrayal. Instead of saying you're disagreeing, they say, "You're being disloyal." That shift changes the emotional meaning of the moment. Now, the person being manipulated doesn't just feel wrong, they feel guilty. In dark psychology, these methods are layered. None of them are threatening on their own, but when combined, repetition, embedded commands, emotional cues, they reshape the way someone interprets a conversation. And once the other person starts following that path, they may not realize how much of their thinking has already been guided. Mirroring and matching. Two people are having a conversation. One leans forward slightly, and moments later, the other does the same. It's not planned. It just happens. And yet, that simple reflection can change how connected they feel. This is the core idea behind mirroring and matching. It's a technique used to build rapport by subtly copying another person's behavior, posture, gestures, tone, pace, even breathing. When done naturally, it helps people feel more understood. But when done intentionally, especially in dark psychology, it can become a tool for influence. Mirroring and matching come from the field of Neuro-Linguistic programming, or NLP. The concept is based on the way human brains are wired to recognize similarity. When someone looks, moves, or sounds like us, we're more likely to trust them. It feels like they're on the same wavelength, even if we just met. There are different layers to how this works. Mirroring typically refers to reflecting body language. If someone crosses their legs or rests their chin on their hand, the other person does something similar, just slightly delayed and subtle enough not to seem like mimicry. Matching, on the other hand, often involves voice, tone, speed, rhythm, or even choice of words. A fast talker might naturally connect better with someone who matches that energy. A calm, slow speaker might feel more comfortable when the other person mirrors that calmness. In normal conversations, this happens automatically when people get along. But in manipulation, it's used deliberately to build trust quickly. A salesperson might mirror a customer's posture and energy to lower resistance. A manipulator might match someone's emotional tone to create the illusion of empathy, even if they don't feel it. The person on the receiving end doesn't consciously notice what's happening. They just feel more open, more relaxed, more connected. The technique can also be used to shift mood. If someone is anxious or upset, the manipulator might first match that tension, speaking quickly, mirroring nervous body language, and then slowly change their own tone and posture to something calmer. Often, the other person follows along unconsciously. It's a way of leading behavior without giving any direct instructions. When combined with other techniques like pacing, anchoring, or embedded suggestions, mirroring and matching become even more powerful. The connection created through similarity makes people more likely to accept ideas, comply with requests, or share sensitive information. It's not mind control, but it does shape perception. Done ethically, this technique can help people feel safe and heard. Therapists, negotiators, and educators often use it to build honest rapport. But in darker applications, it can be used to fake connection, lower defenses, and steer decisions in a subtle, almost invisible way. The strength of mirroring and matching is that it doesn't need to be spoken. It's quiet, physical, and automatic. And that's what makes it so effective. People respond to what feels familiar, and this technique works by making familiarity happen on cue. Anchoring behavior. A song plays, and suddenly a memory surfaces, clear, emotional, and automatic. That's anchoring. It's when the brain links a feeling or response to a specific stimulus, so that one automatically triggers the other. In psychology, anchoring behavior refers to creating a mental connection between an emotional state and a particular cue, something you see, hear, feel, or do. Once that link is made, the cue can be used to bring back the emotion, even if the original situation is long gone. It's how certain smells can calm us, or how a phrase can instantly change someone's mood. In daily life, it helps us form habits and routines. In dark psychology, it can be used to influence behavior in subtle, powerful ways. The idea comes from classical conditioning. Pavlov's dogs salivated when they heard a bell because they had been trained to associate the sound with food. Anchoring works the same way. But instead of food, the emotional reward might be attention, approval, or reassurance. And instead of a bell, the trigger might be a tone of voice, a gesture, or a word. Let's say someone is made to feel confident every time they hear a certain compliment. "You always handle this so well." If that phrase is repeated often enough, especially during positive moments, the brain starts to pair the two. Later, the same phrase can be used to boost confidence again, even in a different situation. That's a positive use of anchoring. But anchoring can also be used to create dependency. For example, A manipulator might consistently offer comfort after making someone feel afraid or insecure. Over time, the victim starts to associate that person's attention with emotional relief. The anchor isn't the support itself, it's the cycle. Discomfort followed by reassurance. That pattern teaches the brain that only one person can bring safety, even if they're the same one causing the stress. Anchors don't need to be verbal. A certain kind of touch, a glance, even a pause in conversation can become cues. If a person always uses a slow, calming tone after gaining compliance, that tone eventually becomes a signal, one the brain associates with ease, trust, or surrender. Anchoring works best when repeated across emotional highs or lows, because the brain remembers what happened when feelings were intense. In dark contexts, anchoring can shape long-term behavior without direct orders. It's not about forcing someone to act. It's about training their brain to associate certain responses with specific cues until the pattern feels automatic. And because the person believes they're acting freely, the control goes unnoticed. Whether used in therapy, relationships, marketing, or manipulation, anchoring behavior is about conditioning. It quietly links emotion to action until all it takes is a subtle trigger to steer a thought, a feeling, or a choice. No pressure, no explanation, just a cue and the response it's been wired to bring back. Language manipulation patterns. A single sentence can change how someone thinks, not because of what it says, but because of how it's structured. That's the foundation of language manipulation patterns. These are specific ways of using words and phrasing to influence thoughts, guide attention, and shape perception without drawing attention to the influence itself. It's not about lying or being aggressive. It's about choosing language that leads the brain to follow a certain path and feel like it arrived there on its own. These patterns are common in sales, politics, therapy, and dark psychology. They work because the human brain looks for shortcuts. When language is structured to sound familiar, agreeable, or emotionally loaded, the listener is more likely to accept it without stopping to question the logic behind it. One of the most basic patterns is the presupposition. This is when a sentence assumes something as already true. For example, "What time should we meet?" doesn't ask if you want to meet. It assumes that you do. The listener often skips over the built-in assumption and responds to the part that seems open-ended. In conversation, this tool makes suggestions feel like background facts, not requests. Another example is the double bind. This pattern presents two choices, both leading to the same outcome. Do you want to start the report now or after lunch? Either option moves the person toward action, even though it feels like they're choosing freely. It reduces resistance because the illusion of control is preserved. Tag questions are also commonly used. These are phrases added at the end of a sentence to suggest agreement. "This makes sense, doesn't it?" Or, "You already know this, right?" These don't ask for real answers. They're built to make agreement easier than disagreement. In many cases, people nod along simply because the phrasing steers them that way. There's also the use of vagueness, which allows the listener to fill in the details themselves. Phrases like, "You're starting to feel different," or "Things are shifting for you," are intentionally unclear. They sound personal, but they don't actually say much. The listener fills in the blanks with their own experience, making the message feel more accurate than it really is. More advanced patterns use emotional language to bypass logic altogether. Words like betray, protect, freedom, or safety carry strong emotional weight. They aren't neutral. When these words are embedded into sentences, they guide how people feel about the subject, even before they've had a chance to think it through. In darker contexts, these language patterns are stacked. A manipulator might use presupposition, tag questions, and emotional framing all in the same sentence. You already understand how important this is, don't you? That's why you're ready to move forward. It sounds like a casual statement, but in reality, it's guiding agreement through structure, not content. Language manipulation doesn't require shouting or pressure. It relies on rhythm, implication, and emotional cues. And when used deliberately, it can quietly shift thoughts and decisions without the listener realizing how much their path has already been shaped. NLP in Persuasion and Sales. A customer walks into a store unsure of what they want. 10 minutes later, they've made a decision they feel good about, without noticing how the salesperson guided them every step of the way. This is how NLP operates in Persuasion and Sales. It's not about pressure or manipulation in the obvious sense. It's about using language, body cues, and mental shortcuts to build trust, guide thought, and influence choices, subtly and efficiently. NLP is based on the idea that the way people process the world, through words, images, and experiences, can be modeled, adjusted, and influenced. In sales, it's used to help a customer feel understood, comfortable, and confident in making a decision that's already been gently shaped. One of the most common NLP tools is mirroring and matching. A skilled salesperson might adjust their posture, speech rhythm, or energy level to match the customer's. If the buyer is calm and deliberate, the salesperson slows down. If the buyer is upbeat and fast-talking, the pace picks up. This creates unconscious rapport. When someone sees a reflection of themselves in another person, they feel more at ease and more likely to trust what that person says. Another key NLP element is language patterning. Instead of asking, "Would you like to buy this today?" which can trigger hesitation, a salesperson might say, "When you get home with this today, you'll notice how much smoother things run." That sentence includes a presupposition. The purchase is already happening. It frames the outcome as assumed, while keeping the tone conversational. NLP also uses the yes ladder, a strategy based on getting small agreements early on. A salesperson might start with easy questions. "You're looking for something more reliable, right?" Or, "You like keeping things simple." Each yes makes the next one easier. By the time the real offer is presented, the buyer's brain is already in agreement mode. Another tactic is anchoring positive emotions to the product or service. For example, during the conversation, the salesperson might highlight a pleasant image. "Imagine how relieved you'll feel when this just works without any hassle," and subtly tap the table or nod as they say it. Later, repeating the gesture or tone while discussing the price brings back that same emotional state. The brain starts to associate that product with relief and confidence. In higher stakes settings like corporate deals or luxury sales, language pacing becomes more refined. The seller states facts the buyer already agrees with. "You've been researching this for weeks, you know your priorities," then links them to the sale. That's why this is the one that fits. It feels like the buyer reached the conclusion, even if they were guided there. When used ethically, NLP helps create a smoother buying experience. It can reduce confusion, align goals, and build faster connections. But when used purely to influence behavior without transparency, it becomes a form of psychological leverage, one that relies less on what's said and more on how it's said. In Persuasion and Sales, that difference can make all the difference. Favorite victims of manipulators. Manipulators don't just target anyone. They look for people who make the process easier, people who already have certain traits that can be used against them. These individuals often become what some psychologists call the favorite victims of manipulators. Not because they deserve it, but because their personality patterns, emotional needs, or life circumstances make them more vulnerable to subtle control. One common trait manipulators look for is people-pleasing behavior. These are individuals who go out of their way to avoid conflict. They'd rather stay quiet than risk upsetting someone. To a manipulator, this means fewer boundaries, easier compliance, and less resistance. Even when something feels wrong, a people-pleaser might ignore it, trying to keep the peace instead of questioning the behavior. Closely related is low self-esteem. A person who doubts their worth is more likely to tolerate disrespect, dismiss their own feelings, or second-guess their instincts. Manipulators often reinforce this mindset by planting subtle criticisms or backhanded compliments, undermining confidence while offering selective approval. Over time, the victim starts depending on the manipulator for validation, even as their self-worth continues to erode. Another frequent target is the overly empathetic. These individuals are quick to understand others' pain, often at the expense of their own boundaries. They excuse bad behavior by rationalizing someone's past or stress. Manipulators use this generosity to rewrite the rules. They frame themselves as misunderstood or wounded. And the empathetic person steps into the role of rescuer, absorbing blame, managing emotions, and taking on responsibility that isn't theirs. Highly conscientious people can also be exploited. These are the rule followers, the helpers, the ones who always show up and try to do the right thing. A manipulator twists this strength into guilt. If you really cared, you'd help me, or you're the only one I can count on. Because conscientious people value reliability and fairness, they stay longer in situations where they're being used, hoping effort will fix the imbalance. Younger or emotionally inexperienced individuals are another common target. A lack of past exposure to manipulation means they may not recognize the signs early on. They might mistake control for care or guilt tripping for honesty. Manipulators often test small boundaries first, just enough to see what they can get away with, then escalate once they know the person won't push back. Even successful or independent people can be vulnerable, especially if they're going through periods of stress, grief, or transition. Manipulators often strike during moments of vulnerability. It's not always about personality, it's about timing. Someone in emotional pain may be more open to comfort, more eager to believe someone's good intentions, and less able to question red flags. What all these favorite victims have in common isn't weakness, it's openness. And in the wrong hands, that openness becomes a tool, used not to connect, but to control. For a manipulator, the ideal target is someone who's willing to listen, ready to care, and slow to suspect. And once that pattern is established, it can take hold before the person even knows what's happening. Emotionally insecure individuals. Some people walk into a room already wondering if they belong. They second-guess what they say, replay conversations in their head, and look to others for reassurance they never quite receive. These are signs of emotional insecurity, and while common, they shape how people think, behave, and relate to others in ways that aren't always obvious. An emotionally insecure individual struggles with an unstable sense of self-worth. Their confidence rises and falls based on outside feedback, approval, attention, or validation. It's not that they don't feel anything, they often feel too much. But instead of using emotion to guide healthy decisions, they use it to measure their value in other people's eyes. This insecurity can show up in different ways. Some people appear needy, constantly seeking reassurance or over-explaining themselves. Others become avoidant, pretending not to care or keeping their distance to avoid getting hurt. Either way, the root is the same, a fear that they're not enough and that this will eventually be exposed. One common behavior is over-apologizing. An emotionally insecure person might say sorry even when nothing went wrong, just to smooth over discomfort or preempt rejection. It's a defensive move. If they apologize first, maybe they won't be criticized. If they downplay their needs, maybe they won't be seen as too much. Another sign is approval seeking. These individuals might take on tasks they don't want, laugh at jokes that make them uncomfortable, or agree with opinions they don't share. The goal isn't deception, it's survival. If they can just keep the peace, maybe they won't lose connection. The problem is, that strategy slowly erodes authenticity. Emotional insecurity also affects relationships. A person might become hyper-attuned to others' moods, constantly adjusting their behavior based on how others seem to feel. A single unread message, a delayed response, or a slightly different tone can trigger anxiety. Their mind fills in the blanks with worst-case scenarios. Not because they're overreacting, but because they're constantly bracing for emotional rejection. This internal tension makes them easier targets for manipulation. When someone doubts their worth, they become more susceptible to guilt, flattery, or fear. A manipulator doesn't need to push hard, just enough to reinforce the insecurity. "You're lucky I put up with this," or "most people wouldn't be as patient with you." These phrases don't need to be true. They just need to land on someone already uncertain. But not all emotionally insecure people are passive. Some compensate by trying to control their environment. They might become overly critical, rigid, or defensive, not out of confidence, but out of fear. If they can manage the world tightly enough, maybe they won't feel so exposed. This often leads to conflict, confusion, or isolation. At its core, emotional insecurity isn't about weakness. It's about instability in how someone sees themselves. And until that image is rebuilt from the inside, they stay emotionally dependent on the outside, trying to feel safe in a world that always feels slightly out of reach. Highly empathetic or sensitive people, they don't need to be told something's wrong. They can often feel it before a word is spoken, not because they're guessing, but because they're paying attention to everything others miss. Highly empathetic or sensitive people are wired to absorb and react to emotional information more deeply than the average person. It's not just that they understand how others feel, it's that they feel it themselves. This sensitivity to emotional cues makes them more aware, more responsive, and often more emotionally invested in the experiences of those around them. Empathy, at its core, is the ability to recognize and connect with another person's emotional state. But high empathy goes a step further. These individuals may feel someone else's pain almost as if it were their own. It's not a conscious effort, it's automatic. A friend's stress, a stranger's sadness, or a co-worker's frustration doesn't just register intellectually. It creates a personal emotional response. That awareness can be a powerful asset. Highly empathetic people tend to be great listeners, thoughtful supporters, and emotionally intelligent communicators. They pick up on non-verbal signals, anticipate emotional shifts, and often diffuse tension before it builds. In group settings, they serve as quiet stabilizers, sensing what needs to be said, or when nothing should be said at all. But this same trait also makes them more vulnerable to emotional overload. Because they're constantly taking in the emotional energy around them, they may become drained in crowded or tense environments. It's not just social fatigue, it's emotional fatigue. Too much exposure without enough recovery can lead to burnout, anxiety, or a loss of emotional clarity. This sensitivity also creates a risk when dealing with manipulative personalities. A manipulator can sense when someone is emotionally open and eager to help. They may exploit that empathy, using guilt, flattery, or emotional stories to pull favors, avoid responsibility, or maintain control. A highly empathetic person may struggle to set limits, not because they don't recognize manipulation, but because they don't want to cause pain, even to someone who's mistreating them. Highly sensitive individuals also tend to internalize conflict more deeply. A critical comment or a cold shoulder may not roll off easily. It can stay with them, replaying in their mind long after the moment has passed. They reflect, reanalyze, and sometimes take on emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry. That doesn't mean they're weak. Their reactions are strong because their emotional radar is always active. But without strategies to manage this sensitivity, like boundary setting, downtime, and emotional detachment when needed, it can become a source of constant emotional stress. In relationships, work environments, or group dynamics, highly empathetic people often take on invisible emotional labor. They smooth things over, absorb tension, and try to make others feel better. Most of the time, they do this quietly and without recognition. But their role is significant, and when unbalanced, it can leave them overextended, giving far more than they receive. Those afraid of loneliness or rejection. A person stays in a relationship that makes them unhappy, not because they don't see the problem, but because the fear of being alone feels worse than the pain of staying. That's the silent power of rejection and loneliness. These aren't just uncomfortable emotions. For some people, they're threats to their sense of identity, safety, and belonging. And that fear of being pushed away, left behind, or forgotten shapes how they think, what they tolerate, and how easily they can be influenced. People who are deeply afraid of loneliness often overextend themselves to stay connected. They agree to things they don't want, suppress opinions, or downplay their needs, just to avoid conflict or disapproval. It's not always obvious on the outside. They might appear agreeable or flexible, but underneath, their choices are being driven by a fear of abandonment. Rejection sensitivity often begins early. A person might grow up in an environment where love felt conditional, earned through behavior, performance, or silence. Over time, they learn to link connection with self-sacrifice. The idea of being left out or criticized doesn't just sting, it confirms a long-held belief that they're somehow not enough. This pattern continues into adulthood. In friendships, these individuals might cling to people who treat them poorly, just to avoid the feeling of loss. In romantic relationships, they may tolerate disrespect or manipulation, hoping their loyalty will keep the other person close. Even in professional settings, they may avoid speaking up or asserting themselves, fearing that doing so could lead to exclusion or backlash. Manipulators often recognize this dynamic quickly. They test boundaries early through small acts of emotional withdrawal, passive-aggressive comments, or subtle threats of separation. The goal is to trigger that core fear. Once the person begins chasing reassurance, the manipulator takes control of the emotional balance. Approval becomes a reward. Silence becomes a punishment. And the person on the receiving end feels trapped, constantly adjusting to avoid rejection. Some people in this group are highly agreeable. Others may appear independent, but internally they're always scanning for signs of disconnection. A delayed reply, a change in tone, a missed invitation. These small events can trigger intense self-doubt or emotional distress. They might over-apologize, over-explain, or overcompensate to repair what wasn't broken in the first place. What makes this fear so effective in manipulation is that it doesn't rely on logic. You can't reason someone out of emotional hunger. The drive to stay connected, even at the cost of self-respect, overrides facts, red flags, and long-term consequences. And because rejection is tied to survival instincts, it becomes hard to separate what's healthy from what's familiar. This group doesn't lack awareness. Often, they know the situation is unfair, but the cost of speaking up, setting limits, or walking away feels like emotional isolation, and that cost feels too high. When fear of rejection sits at the core of someone's behavior, control doesn't require force. It only requires the constant threat of disconnection. People with dependency issues, they don't make decisions without checking with someone else first, not because they can't, but because they've learned to doubt their own judgment. People with dependency issues often struggle with autonomy. They rely heavily on others for emotional support, direction, and even identity. While everyone needs connection, dependency becomes problematic when it limits a person's ability to function independently or makes them vulnerable to control. This pattern can start early. A child raised in an overly controlling or unpredictable environment may learn that safety comes from pleasing others, staying close, or avoiding conflict. As they grow older, they begin to equate stability with attachment, even if the attachment is unhealthy. The underlying belief is simple: I can't handle things on my own. In adult life, this shows up in many ways. Someone might avoid making even small decisions without consulting someone else. They may defer constantly to a partner, parent, or friend, afraid of making the wrong choice. In relationships, they tend to prioritize connection at any cost, even if that means tolerating neglect, criticism, or control. At work, this person may hesitate to take initiative or express disagreement. They want approval, not confrontation. In group settings, they might blend in rather than stand out, hoping that going along with the majority will protect them from disapproval or exclusion. What makes this dynamic particularly fragile is the intense fear of abandonment. People with dependency issues often believe that if they speak up, assert needs, or make mistakes, they'll be rejected. So they over-apologize, over-accommodate, or quietly suppress their own needs. The relationship becomes less about mutual respect and more about survival. Manipulators easily recognize this vulnerability. All they have to do is create an emotional imbalance, pulling away just enough to trigger the fear of loss. Once the dependent person begins seeking reassurance or approval, control becomes easy. The manipulator doesn't have to be overtly abusive. A simple change in tone, a delayed response, or a vague threat of disconnection is often enough to keep the other person compliant. This dependency also creates emotional outsourcing. Instead of building confidence through personal experience, the individual looks to someone else for certainty. Am I doing this right? Do you still care? Tell me what to do. These aren't just occasional questions. They become the foundation for how the person operates in the world. Over time, this can lead to exhaustion, not just for the dependent person, but also for the people around them. Relationships may become unbalanced, with one person always managing the other's emotions. And when the dependent person senses that dynamic shifting, their anxiety often increases, leading to clinginess, panic, or emotional shutdown. It's important to understand that dependency isn't about laziness or weakness. It's usually the result of long-term emotional conditioning. But left unaddressed, it creates a pattern where the need for connection outweighs the need for boundaries, leaving the individual open to manipulation, guilt, and loss of control over their own life. How to defend against dark psychology. Someone changes their tone mid-conversation, and suddenly you feel guilty without knowing why. You say yes to something you didn't really agree to. It's subtle and it's easy to miss, but it's not random. This is how dark psychology often works. It uses emotional triggers, manipulation tactics, and social pressure to override critical thinking. Defending against it isn't about being suspicious of everyone. It's about recognizing patterns that are designed to steer behavior in ways that don't serve you. The first line of defense is self-awareness. Most manipulative techniques, like guilt-tripping, gaslighting, or emotional blackmail, depend on confusion. If you're unsure of your own values, limits, or instincts, it becomes easier for someone else to impose theirs. Learning to pause and ask, "What am I actually feeling?" gives space between the stimulus and your response. That space is where choice lives. Next is understanding boundaries and holding them. Boundaries aren't just about saying no. They're about identifying what behavior you're willing to accept and what crosses the line. Manipulators often test boundaries gradually. They may start with small favors, dismissive comments, or passive pressure. If those go unchallenged, the behavior escalates. A clear, calm boundary, stated without apology, sends a strong signal that you're not easy to push. Another critical tool is recognizing emotional manipulation patterns. For example, the false dilemma. If you cared, you'd do this. Or the shifting blame technique. I wouldn't act this way if you didn't make me. These phrases are designed to create pressure or guilt, not clarity. When you hear emotionally loaded language followed by a demand, it's a sign someone may be trying to control the narrative. Staying grounded in facts over feelings is also key. Manipulators often exploit emotional highs and lows. They may use flattery to lower defenses or anger to derail the conversation. When emotion runs high, judgment runs low. Repeating the facts, quietly and internally, can stop that spiral. I said no. This doesn't feel fair. Their tone just changed. Keeping track of simple, observable details helps anchor your perspective when the situation feels off. Limiting disclosure can also help. The more a manipulator knows about your fears, insecurities, or emotional needs, the more material they have to use. That doesn't mean being closed off, but it does mean being selective. Early in a relationship, take note of how someone responds to your vulnerability. Do they listen, or do they store it for later? Finally, build a support system that reflects reality. When something feels manipulative, talking it through with someone outside the situation can reset your thinking. Isolation is one of the most effective tools of dark psychology. Perspective is one of the best antidotes. Defending against dark psychology isn't about memorizing tactics. It's about strengthening your internal compass. When your sense of self is clear and your boundaries are firm, even the most skilled manipulator has far less room to move. Awareness and observation. A conversation ends, but something doesn't sit right. You can't point to one thing, just a vague discomfort that lingers. That discomfort is data, and the skill of turning subtle cues into useful information is at the heart of awareness and observation. In dark psychology, most tactics rely on going unnoticed. Manipulation isn't loud. It's quiet, layered into tone, timing, or phrasing. That's why awareness isn't just a passive trait. It's an active defense. It's what helps someone detect the difference between ordinary behavior and something designed to control, distort, or unsettle. Awareness is the ability to track both what's happening around you and how you're reacting to it in real time. It's not about overanalyzing every word someone says. It's about staying mentally present. That means noticing the sudden change in someone's body language when a topic shifts, or the way a compliment is phrased to hide a jab. It means observing not only what's said, but how it's delivered, and what your instincts are doing in response. Observation turns subtle patterns into clear signals. For example, a person who constantly interrupts when you're setting boundaries may be testing how firm those boundaries are. Or someone who regularly deflects questions by turning them back on you. Why are you being so defensive? Maybe using that as a diversion. These are behavioral patterns, and once they're seen clearly, they're harder to ignore or excuse. But observation also works internally. When someone says something that makes you feel confused, guilty, or suddenly unsure of yourself, that internal shift is a red flag. Manipulators often target emotional reactions because they can override logic. Being able to pause and name what you're feeling, without immediately reacting, creates distance between you and the trigger. That distance is where clear thinking happens. Training observation doesn't require special tools. It starts with slowing down your responses and noticing your surroundings. Who dominates the conversation? Who stays silent? When do tones change? How often do people use guilt, urgency, or flattery to influence outcomes? These questions aren't for paranoia, they're for clarity. Even small exercises can help. Mentally tracking the emotional tone of a conversation, or observing the difference between what someone says and what their face or posture reveals, builds this muscle. Over time, you start seeing patterns sooner, and with less effort. Highly aware individuals don't just hear what's said, they track rhythm, timing, choice of words, and emotional undercurrents. They listen to the pace of the conversation, the moments of hesitation, the statements that are framed as questions. It's not about being suspicious. It's about reading the full message, not just the headline. In environments where manipulation can thrive, passive attention isn't enough. Awareness and observation act as filters. They help you separate what's being communicated from what's being concealed. And once you're attuned to those signals, it becomes much harder for anyone to slip past your defenses unnoticed. Emotional regulation. A tense message comes in, your heart rate jumps, and before thinking it through, you've already responded emotionally. That split-second reaction can shape outcomes, for better or worse. This is where emotional regulation becomes essential. It's the ability to recognize, understand, and manage your emotional responses in real time. Not by suppressing feelings, but by handling them in a way that keeps you in control, even under stress, conflict, or manipulation. Emotional regulation isn't about becoming emotionally neutral. It's about staying steady when things around you aren't. It allows you to feel anger without lashing out, to feel fear without shutting down, and to respond to pressure with intention instead of impulse. In situations involving dark psychology, this ability becomes more than just a skill. It becomes a shield. At the foundation of emotional regulation is awareness. You can't manage what you don't notice. This means catching the early signs of emotional shifts, tight shoulders, racing thoughts, a sudden urge to justify yourself. Those small changes are cues. They tell you something is happening internally before it explodes externally. Once you recognize a rising emotion, the next step is to name it clearly. Anger, frustration, embarrassment, anxiety. Each comes with its own reaction patterns. Simply identifying what you're feeling helps to slow the emotional momentum. You're no longer swept up in the current, you're watching it move. The key to managing those emotions is giving them space without suppression. That could mean pausing before responding, taking a few slow breaths, or redirecting your focus briefly to something neutral. These techniques interrupt the automatic loop of emotion to action. They're not about avoidance, they're about regaining choice. In high-pressure interactions, especially where manipulation is at play, emotional regulation becomes a form of protection. Manipulators rely on emotional instability. If they can provoke guilt, shame, or confusion, they gain control. But when you stay calm and emotionally contained, they lose their leverage. This doesn't mean becoming detached or robotic. It means learning to express emotion in ways that serve your long-term goals rather than immediate reactions. For example, calmly stating, "That doesn't sit right with me," is far more powerful than shouting, "You're manipulating me." The first invites clarity, the second hands over control. Even non-verbal regulation matters. Your tone, posture, and breathing all send signals. A calm posture in a tense moment tells the other person they're not in charge of your state. And more importantly, it tells your nervous system the same thing. Building this skill takes time. It involves practice during both calm and stressful situations. But over time, it changes how you move through the world. You stop reacting out of habit and start responding out of clarity. In environments where psychological pressure is common, whether in relationships, work, or manipulation scenarios, emotional regulation gives you an anchor. It doesn't erase the emotion. It simply ensures the emotion doesn't take the lead. Building self-esteem. They hesitate before sharing an opinion, apologize for things that aren't their fault, or constantly look to others for validation. These are quiet signs of low self-esteem, and they shape how someone navigates nearly every part of life. Self-esteem is a person's internal sense of worth. It's not about arrogance or thinking you're better than others. It's about knowing, at a basic level, that you are enough, that your needs matter, that your thoughts and feelings are valid, and that you don't need to prove your value every time you enter a room. Building self-esteem isn't just about positive thinking. It's about gradually changing the way you relate to yourself. Many people with low self-esteem grew up in environments where they were criticized, overlooked, or taught to suppress their voice. Over time, they began to internalize those messages. Now, instead of hearing, "You're not good enough" from others, they hear it from themselves. One core part of building self-esteem is identifying distorted self-talk. These are the automatic thoughts that tear down confidence. "I always mess things up." "No one wants to hear what I think." "I probably don't deserve this." These thoughts feel familiar, but they're not facts, they're habits. And habits can be changed. The next step is replacing those patterns with balanced, realistic self-statements. Not false flattery, but grounded reminders. "I'm learning." "That didn't go as planned, but it doesn't mean I'm a failure." "I handled that better than I would have last year." These shifts might feel awkward at first, but repetition builds internal stability. Equally important is setting boundaries. People with low self-esteem often struggle to say no or speak up, fearing that doing so will cost them connection. But building self-esteem requires practicing respect for yourself. Boundaries aren't about being harsh. They're about showing yourself that your time, energy, and values deserve protection. Another effective method is competence-based confidence. This comes from doing things that challenge you, learning through action, and proving to yourself that you're capable. It could be something small, like speaking up once in a meeting, or something larger, like setting a personal goal and following through. These actions send a message to the brain: I can handle things. It also helps to limit exposure to people who reinforce negative beliefs. If someone constantly undermines, belittles, or dismisses you, their words can reinforce internal doubts. That doesn't always mean cutting people off, but it does mean creating distance between their opinion and your identity. In the context of dark psychology, strong self-esteem is a natural defense. Manipulators prey on doubt, guilt, and insecurity. But someone with healthy self-esteem doesn't hand over their worth for someone else to evaluate. They may still feel emotions, but they don't use those emotions as a measure of who they are. At its core, building self-esteem is about learning to trust yourself, not to be perfect, not to be fearless, but to stand on your own side, even when things feel uncertain. That's what turns confidence from a mood into a mindset. Protecting others from manipulation. A friend keeps making excuses for someone who constantly criticizes them. They brush it off, say it's just a misunderstanding, and change the subject. But you can tell something isn't right. Protecting others from manipulation doesn't mean stepping in to control their choices. It means helping them recognize dynamics they might not see clearly, especially when emotional pressure or psychological tactics are involved. Manipulation thrives in confusion and silence. That's why clarity, support, and subtle guidance can make a real difference. The first step is paying attention. People under manipulative influence often show subtle signs: hesitation when speaking, self-blame, or sudden shifts in confidence. They may seem more withdrawn or uncertain. These changes usually happen gradually, which is why noticing the pattern matters more than focusing on any single moment. If you spot these signs, the next step is creating a safe space for honest conversation. Instead of confronting them with accusations, focus on listening. Make it easier for them to speak without fear of being judged or corrected. The goal isn't to label their experience, it's to help them reflect on it without pressure. Most people in manipulative situations feel isolated. Simply having someone willing to hear them can loosen the grip of control. When the time is right, you can begin to name patterns without attacking the person involved. Rather than saying, "That person is toxic," you might say, "It seems like you've been doing a lot of the work in that dynamic." Or, "It's interesting how they always turn things around when you bring up your feelings." Framing observations in neutral terms encourages insight without pushing them into defense. It also helps to reinforce their self-trust. Manipulators often chip away at a person's confidence, making them second-guess their instincts. Reminding someone of their strengths, past decisions, and ability to set boundaries can slowly rebuild that foundation. For example, "You've always had good judgment. You're just under a lot of pressure right now," can be more effective than "You need to get out." In some situations, it may be necessary to challenge the manipulator directly, but this requires caution. Confrontation can escalate the situation, especially if the manipulator senses they're losing control. In many cases, subtle resistance, like interrupting the cycle, redirecting conversations, or supporting boundary setting, can be more effective than outright conflict. For younger or more impressionable individuals, like teenagers, co-workers, or isolated family members, education is key. Teaching them basic signs of manipulation, emotional coercion, and boundary violations gives them tools they can use independently. It's not about rescuing them. It's about making sure they have options. The final piece is staying available. Leaving a manipulative situation often happens slowly and in stages. There may be backtracking, denial, or confusion. Your steady presence, calm, clear, and non-judgmental, can become the anchor they rely on when they finally start seeing things for what they are. Manipulation isolates, but awareness, support, and consistency reconnect people to their own clarity, and that's where protection starts to work. Conclusion: it's not always the obvious threats that do the most damage. Sometimes it's the slow erosion of clarity, the subtle twists in language, the quiet pressure to conform. That's the landscape of dark psychology, where influence crosses the line into control and where persuasion becomes manipulation. Understanding this field isn't about learning tricks to outsmart people. It's about recognizing how human behavior, emotional vulnerability, and cognitive bias can be used, sometimes carefully, sometimes carelessly, to steer thoughts, decisions, and relationships. And it's about learning how to protect yourself and others from that influence. Across all the tactics explored, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, mirroring, fear, emotional leverage, the common thread is power. Not power in the dramatic sense, but the kind that slips into daily life through words, tone, and timing. Whether in friendships, romantic dynamics, the workplace, or sales, these strategies rely on one person becoming uncertain while the other stays sure. Defending against manipulation starts with clarity. Clarity about your own values, boundaries, and emotional signals. Manipulation works best when those things are murky, when someone's behavior feels wrong but you're not sure why, or when guilt overrides your better judgment. Awareness gives structure to that confusion. It allows you to spot patterns, stay grounded, and make deliberate choices rather than reactive ones. Equally important is developing the ability to regulate emotions. A calm, measured response under pressure is often enough to deflate a manipulator's control. The more unpredictable your reaction, the more room there is for someone else to fill that space with influence. Emotional stability doesn't mean hiding how you feel. It means expressing it in a way that doesn't compromise your position or clarity. Building self-esteem is another layer of defense. People with strong self-respect are harder to guilt, flatter, or destabilize. Their boundaries don't shift just because someone else wants them to. They can tolerate disapproval without collapsing into self-doubt. That doesn't mean they're immune to influence. It means they can step back, process, and decide on their own terms. But understanding dark psychology isn't just about self-defense. It's also about recognizing how influence can be used ethically. Influence by itself isn't negative. It's part of teaching, parenting, leadership, communication. What matters is intent and impact. Ethical influence respects the other person's autonomy. Manipulation doesn't. The practical takeaway from studying dark psychology isn't to see enemies everywhere. It's to refine your ability to observe, interpret, and respond without giving away your judgment. That skill helps you navigate difficult conversations, maintain healthier relationships, and support others who might be stuck in dynamics they don't yet understand. Dark psychology isn't just a theory. It's a set of tools. Some use them to deceive. Others use them to defend. The more familiar you are with how these tools work, the better equipped you are to recognize them, resist them, and make sure you're never unknowingly working against yourself.